Chapter 1. The lower ring of the Pride City never truly slept. Red light bled up from the vents beneath the old cathedral district and painted the clouds the color of a fresh bruise, and somewhere far off a radio tower buzzed a station that played nothing but static and old jazz. In the middle of all that noise, behind a set of doors that had once belonged to a very different kind of establishment, the Has-Been Hotel stood with its lights on. Charlie Morningstar had never planned on being anyone's mother. She had planned on redemption, on second chances, on proving to an entire afterlife that the things everyone called irredeemable could still choose to be gentle. She had not planned on a small, wailing bundle with a shock of dark green hair, wrapped in a blanket that had been stitched together from 3 different bar towels because nobody in the hotel owned baby supplies. But plans, Charlie had learned, were the first thing hell took away from you, and the first thing it gave back tenfold. Vaggie stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her one good eye fixed on the bundle in her partner's hands, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she crossed the room in 4 long strides and looked down at the baby's face, at the 2 small marks under his eyes that were not freckles and not scars but something in between, something that marked him as belonging to nobody and everybody at once. "He's ours," Vaggie said. It was not a question. It had never really been a question, not since the moment the old moth-winged midwife had placed him in Charlie's arms and murmured a blessing older than the concept of sin itself. "He's ours," Charlie agreed, and she meant it with the whole of a heart that had spent 100 years trying to convince a kingdom of monsters that hearts were worth having. They named him Izuku. It was not a demon name, not a name that belonged to any of the old bloodlines that ran through the Pride Ring like rivers of poison. Charlie had found it in a dream, she said, though Vaggie suspected it had come from one of the old human books that lined the hotel library, water-damaged paperbacks salvaged from a world neither of them had seen in centuries. Whatever its origin, it fit him the moment they said it aloud, the way certain names simply do. He grew up between 2 worlds without ever quite belonging to either. In hell, demon children were born already knowing how to bare their teeth. They came out screaming with claws instead of fingernails, or wings instead of arms, or some other mark of their family's particular flavor of sin stamped into their bodies before they had drawn a single breath outside the womb. Izuku had none of that. He had ordinary hands, ordinary skin, a face that freckled instead of scaled, and a laugh that carried too easily, too honestly, through halls that had not heard honest laughter in longer than anyone could remember. The other demon children of the ring noticed. Demon children always noticed weakness the way sharks noticed blood, and Izuku, gentle and quirkless and soft in a place that worshipped strength, was blood in the water from the moment he could walk. It was on one of the worst of those days, when he was 4 years old and had been shoved face first into a gutter by a pack of imp children twice his size, laughing at him for crying, laughing at him for bleeding, laughing at him simply for existing without fangs, that he first met her. She came down out of the alley like something summoned. A girl his own age, maybe a year older, with skin the pale gray blue of deep water and a fin that curved back from her spine like a shark's dorsal, sharp enough to look dangerous and somehow, on her, more decorative than threatening. Her eyes were black from lid to lid, no whites at all, and when she opened her mouth to speak her teeth were rows and rows of small serrated points, and none of that stopped Izuku, even through the sting of his split lip, from thinking she looked like the bravest thing he had ever seen. "Hey," she said to the imp children, and her voice had a strange double quality to it, like 2 voices speaking half a second apart. "Pick on someone your own size." "He is our size," one of the imps sneered. "Then pick on me instead," she said, and grinned wide enough to show every one of those teeth, and something about the sheer confidence of it, the utter lack of fear, made the imp children take one look at her fin and her teeth and decide that whatever fun they'd been having wasn't worth the risk. They scattered into the red haze of the alley and did not come back. The girl crouched down in front of Izuku, who was still curled in the gutter with his knees pulled to his chest, and reached out one gray hand toward the cut above his eyebrow. He flinched. She did not touch him, not right away. She only held her hand there, an inch above the wound, and waited, patient in a way that 4-year-olds were rarely patient, until he stopped flinching on his own. "I'm Molly," she said. "You're bleeding a lot for such a small cut." "I bleed easy," Izuku mumbled. "I don't got claws or teeth or anything. Everyone says I'm not a real demon." Molly considered this with the gravity only a small child can bring to a serious question. You don't look like a demon, she agreed. But you don't smell like a human either. You smell like clouds. I don't know what I am, Izuku admitted, and his voice cracked, not from the pain in his lip but from something older and heavier that a 4-year-old should not have already been carrying. Molly's hand finally touched his forehead, right at the cut, and warmth spread out from her palm, gentle as candlelight, and the sting in his lip eased into nothing at all. He watched, wide-eyed, as the split skin knit itself back together beneath her fingers, leaving nothing behind but a faint pink line that would fade within the hour. There, Molly said, satisfied, wiping her hand on her shorts as if healing a wound were no different from wiping off dirt. My mom says I got a healing thing. A quirk, she called it. She says it's rare down here. Everybody else has claws and fire and stuff, and I just make things better. That's not weak, Izuku said immediately, fiercely, surprising himself with how strongly he meant it. That's amazing. You fixed me in like 2 seconds. Molly blinked at him, and something in her sharp-toothed face softened into a smile that had none of the danger of a moment before. Nobody had ever called her healing amazing. In a ring built on violence, a quirk that could not hurt anyone was usually treated as a joke, a curiosity, something to be tolerated rather than admired. She had grown up hearing it called useless nearly as often as Izuku had grown up hearing himself called broken. You think so? She asked. I know so, Izuku said, and held out his small hand, the way he had seen the hotel's guests do sometimes when they made a deal they actually intended to keep. I'm Izuku. Will you be my friend? Molly looked at his hand, then at his face, then shook it with a grip far too strong for a child her size. Obviously, she said, as though the question had been a silly one to even ask. Somebody's gotta keep the idiots off you. You cry too easy to do it yourself. It should have been an insult. From anyone else it might have stung. From Molly, grinning her shark's grin with her hand still wrapped around his, it felt instead like the first promise anyone had ever made him and meant to keep. He walked her home that evening, or rather she walked him, since her territory in the ring bordered the alley behind the hotel and she seemed to know every shortcut through the maze of tenements and back streets by heart. Her family ran a small shop that sold salvaged human world curiosities to demons who liked to collect strange trinkets from the world above, and her mother, a broad-shouldered woman with the same gray-blue skin and an entire mouth of the same serrated teeth, took one look at the state of Izuku's shirt and immediately set about finding him a clean one from the shop's back room without asking a single question about how he'd gotten so filthy in the first place. Some things, apparently, did not need explaining to a mother who had raised a shark. When Charlie came looking for him at dusk, trailing Vaggie and a growing edge of panic, she found her son sitting cross-legged on the floor of a cluttered little shop, sorting through a box of human world seashells with a girl who had a fin down her spine and a grin that could have cut glass, and the two of them were laughing so hard that neither noticed the door open. There you are, Charlie breathed, half relief and half exasperation, crouching down to check him over for injuries out of long habit. Mom, this is Molly, Izuku announced, before she could even ask what happened to his shirt. She's my friend now. She fixed my face with her quirk and she scared off the mean kids and she has a fin and I want to come here every day. Charlie looked at Molly, who looked back at her with the frank, unblinking assessment of a child deciding whether an adult was trustworthy, and something about the steadiness of that black-eyed stare, the total lack of fear even in the presence of the princess of hell herself, made Charlie's chest go warm in a way she hadn't expected. Well, Charlie said, glancing at Vaggie, who was watching the whole scene with the faintest, rarest ghost of a smile tugging at her scarred mouth, I suppose we'll have to have you over for dinner sometime, Molly. Can she come every day? Izuku asked, tugging at his mother's sleeve with the single-minded intensity only a 4-year-old who has just found his first real friend can produce. We'll see, Charlie said, which both children correctly interpreted as a yes that simply hadn't been said out loud yet. That was how it began. Not with prophecy, not with destiny, not with any of the grand designs that usually open stories about children who would go on to matter. It began with a split lip in a gutter, a girl who healed instead of harmed, and a promise sealed with a handshake too strong for either of their small hands, on a street that smelled of sulfur and old rain. Neither of them knew yet what the years ahead would ask of them. But from that evening on, they walked through the Pride Ring's cracked streets together, and whatever waited for Izuku Morningstar Midoriya in the world above, he would not walk toward it alone. Chapter 2. By the time they were 6, Molly had appointed herself Izuku's permanent shadow, and nobody in the Pride Ring, least of all the children who had once thought him easy prey, questioned the arrangement twice. She walked him to the little demon schoolhouse the hotel had helped fund, sat beside him through lessons on the old infernal bloodlines and the etiquette of deal-making, and made absolutely certain that anyone who so much as looked at him wrong left the schoolyard with a very clear understanding of why that had been a mistake. She never actually had to fight anyone. That was the strange, wonderful thing about Molly, something Izuku noticed and admired long before he had the words to explain why it mattered so much. She did not need claws or fire or the kind of casual cruelty that most demon children wielded like a birthright. She simply stood her ground, bared her teeth, and let the reputation of the girl who had healed a hotel guest's shattered arm in front of half the ring do the rest of the work for her. Word traveled fast in hell. By the time Izuku was 7, most of the ring's children had simply decided that whatever they thought about the quirkless human boy who lived at the hotel, it was not worth finding out what his shark-toothed friend would do about it. That did not mean the words stopped. Words were harder to fight than fists, and Molly, for all her fierce protectiveness, could not heal the kind of wound that came from being told, over and over, in 100 small careless ways, that you did not belong in the only world you had ever known. "You're not even a real demon," a boy named Grail sneered one afternoon in the schoolyard, older, taller, with a pair of ram's horns just beginning to curl above his ears. "You're not a real human either. You're not anything. My dad says your mom's just found you and decided to keep you like a stray." Izuku, 7 years old and already too good at swallowing things that hurt, said nothing. He had learned, in the years since that first gutter, that silence usually ended arguments faster than tears did. But Molly, standing at his shoulder with her arms crossed and her fin bristling, had never once in her life learned to swallow anything. "His moms are the princess of hell and her second," Molly said, in a tone that suggested Grail had just said something spectacularly stupid, which means his family could end your whole bloodline with a phone call, and you're out here running your mouth about strays. "Also," she added, before Grail could summon a retort, "I healed your sister's broken wing last month for free because your family couldn't afford the exterminator's rates, so maybe think real hard about whether you want to keep talking." Grail did not keep talking. He went very pale under his horns and found somewhere else to be, and Izuku, watching him go, felt the familiar tangle of gratitude and shame twist in his chest. Gratitude, because Molly had, once again, made the world a little safer for him without being asked. Shame, because some small, stubborn part of him wished he could make the world safer for himself. He told her that, once, sitting on the roof of the hotel's east wing where they liked to go when the noise of the lobby got to be too much. The sky over hell did not really have stars, only the dull red smear of the overcast that never quite cleared, but the two of them had gotten very good at pretending the brighter smudges of light were something like constellations. "I don't want you to always have to save me," he said quietly, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. Molly considered this the way she considered most things, without rushing, chewing on the thought the way she sometimes literally chewed on things when she was working out a problem. "I don't save you because you're weak," she said finally. "I save you because that's what you do for people you care about." "You think I don't need saving sometimes too?" Izuku looked up at that, surprised. In his mind Molly had never needed anything from anyone. She was healer and protector both, fin and teeth and gentle hands, an entire fortress wrapped around a person he loved with the uncomplicated devotion only a child could manage. "When?" he asked. "Every time somebody calls my quirk useless," Molly said, and for once her voice lost its confident edge, dropped into something smaller and more honest. "Everybody down here worships strength that hurts. Claws, fire, poison, whatever. Nobody thinks healing counts as strong, because it doesn't break anything. My own uncle told my mom I'd end up some rich demon's pet nurse because that's all a power like mine is good for." She picked at the frayed hem of her shorts. "You're the only one who's ever told me it was amazing. So I guess we save each other. That's fair, right?" Izuku did not have a good answer for that, not one that felt big enough for what she'd just said, so instead he did the only thing that felt true, which was to shift closer on the roof tiles until their shoulders bumped together, and stay there in silence while the false stars did their slow, dull crawl across the smeared red sky. It was around that same year that Charlie first showed him the portal. The Has-Been Hotel had never been an ordinary building, not even by Hell's own generous standards of not ordinary. Deep in its basement, behind a door that Vaggie kept locked with 3 separate wards, sat a mirror as tall as the ceiling, its surface rippling faintly like disturbed water even when nothing touched it. It was, Charlie explained, one of the last stable crossings between their world and the world of the living, a relic from a much older deal than the one that had built the hotel itself, and it was through that mirror that Charlie's own strange, complicated ties to the human world still ran. There are people up there fighting for things to get better too, Charlie told him, kneeling beside him in front of the glass while it rippled with faint hints of a city he had never seen. Tall buildings. Bright, clean light that did not come from fire. Figures in the far distance leaping between rooftops in ways no ordinary human body should have been able to manage. They call them heroes. People with quirks, using them to protect others instead of just to win. Izuku pressed his small hand flat against the glass, and for the first time in his short life, something in his chest that had always felt clenched and small unfurled a little. Heroes, he repeated, tasting the word. Some people even say, Charlie added, more gently, watching her son's face with the particular ache of a mother who already suspects which direction her child's heart is about to run, that there's a whole school up there. UA. Trains the strongest, bravest kids in the world to grow up and become heroes themselves. Izuku did not sleep well that night. He lay awake in the dark with Molly's promise and his mother's mirror both turning over and over in his mind, and somewhere in the small hours before dawn, an idea took root in him that would not let go for the rest of his life. He wanted to be a hero. Not a demon prince, not an heir to anyone's throne, not even simply Molly's protected friend forever. He wanted, with the whole desperate hope of a child who had spent his life being told he was nothing, to be someone who saved people the way Molly had saved him. He told her the next morning, breathless, words tumbling over each other in his hurry to get them out. He told her about the mirror, about the city of bright light, about the word hero and everything it seemed to promise. He watched her face carefully, half afraid she would laugh, because hell did not raise children who believed in things like heroes. Molly did not laugh. She listened, all the way to the end, with her black eyes fixed on him and her sharp teeth worrying at her bottom lip in thought, and when he finally ran out of words she said, simply, okay. Then I'm coming too. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, in the same tone she'd used on Grail, the tone that meant the conversation was already over. I want to. Somebody has to keep you from tripping over your own feet running toward danger, and it might as well be me. Besides. She grinned, teeth and all, fierce and bright. I want to be a hero too. I just didn't know it was allowed until you said it out loud. That was Molly's particular gift, Izuku would come to understand over the years that followed, though it would take him a long time to find the words for it. She did not simply heal wounds. She had a way of taking whatever fragile, half-formed hope a person carried and making it feel, instantly and completely, like something allowed. Something real. Something worth chasing all the way up out of hell itself and into a bright unfamiliar world neither of them had ever seen. They shook on it that day too, the way they had on the very first day, small hands locked together on the rooftop under the false stars, and if either of them had any idea just how much distance and difficulty stood between a shark demon's promise and a human world's hero course, neither one let it show. Chapter 3. The move to the human world did not happen all at once, the way Izuku had half imagined it would in his most excitable daydreams. There was no single dramatic morning where he stepped through the basement mirror and never looked back. Instead it happened the way most enormous changes in a child's life happen, in a slow accumulation of small decisions made by the adults around him, discussed in hushed voices after bedtime that he was never quite as asleep for as everyone assumed. Charlie and Vaggie argued about it more than once, though never in front of him if they could help it. Vaggie worried, endlessly and out loud, about sending an 8-year-old boy who could not so much as summon a spark of flame into a world that would see him as nothing more than an ordinary, quirkless human, unaware of the demonic blood that ran quietly and strangely dormant somewhere beneath his skin. Charlie worried too, in her own way, but her worry had always run in a different direction than Vaggie's. She worried less about what the human world might do to her son, and more about what staying in hell, staring forever at a doorway to a life he could never have, might do to his heart. He wants to be a hero, Charlie said one night, low, in the little office behind the front desk where she still kept a framed photograph of the hotel's very first guests. You should have seen his face when I showed him the mirror, Baggy. I have never seen him look like that. Not once. He's a demon's son living in a school full of demon children, Baggy said, though there was no real fight left in the words, only the tired, protective ache of someone who had learned the hard way that love and safety did not always point in the same direction. How is he supposed to just walk into a hero course like nothing's different? He's a demon's son who bleeds like a human, ages like a human, and has never once shown a trace of a demon quirk, Charlie said gently. Down here, that makes him an outsider. Up there, it might just make him ordinary. And Izuku has never once wanted to be extraordinary because of what he is. He's wanted it because of what he could choose to do. In the end it was Molly's mother, of all people, who tipped the argument, arriving one evening at the hotel with a request so blunt that even Baggy could not find a way to refuse it. Her name was Marlin, and she ran her little shop with the same steady, unshakable calm that her daughter carried into every fight she never had to have. My girl wants to go with him, Marlin said, standing in the hotel lobby with her arms crossed, looking Baggy dead in her one good eye without so much as a flicker of the deference most demons instinctively offered hell's ruling family. She's been talking about heroes for a year now, ever since your boy got that mirror in his head. I'm not about to tell her no, because I already tried and she informed me, very clearly, that she was going with or without my blessing. So the question isn't whether these two are leaving. The question is whether they're going up there together, with people who love them helping, or whether they find some other way to sneak through that I won't be able to watch over. Baggy had looked, in that moment, less like the fearsome second of hell's royal family and more like any parent anywhere, faced with the plain, unwinnable arithmetic of a child who had already decided their own future. Together, then, she said finally, and that was that. The crossing itself, when it finally came, was smaller and stranger than Izuku had expected. There was no grand ceremony, no crowd of demon well-wishers gathered to see them off. Just the four of them, Charlie, Baggy, Marlin, and a very nervous shopkeeper's assistant who would look after the family shop in Marlin's absence, standing in front of the rippling basement mirror on a quiet weekday morning, while Izuku and Molly held hands so tightly their knuckles ached. You remember everything we practiced? Charlie asked, crouching to Izuku's height one last time, smoothing down a cowlick that had never once in his life stayed smooth. The cover story, the paperwork, the human names on your documents? Izuku Midoriya, he recited dutifully. Adopted. Mom works overseas a lot, that's why we moved. Nobody has to know about, you know. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the whole invisible weight of hell and horns and thrones that sat behind that single careful cover story. And you, Baggy said, turning her attention to Molly, whose fin had been carefully wrapped in a long scarf and whose teeth she had been practicing, with visible effort, to keep hidden behind a closed-mouthed smile. You look out for him. Really look out for him. Not just from bullies. From himself, sometimes, when his brain runs faster than his good sense. Always have, Molly said simply, and there was nothing performative in it at all, just plain fact, stated the way one might state the sky was red or the sun did not shine in hell. The mirror's surface rippled outward from the center like a stone dropped into still water, and for one dizzying, weightless moment the whole world tipped sideways, red light and static jazz giving way all at once to a rush of blue sky and a sun so bright and so real that Izuku had to shut his eyes against it. When he opened them again, he was standing on ordinary pavement in an ordinary city, holding Molly's hand, with the noise of human traffic and human voices washing over him in a wave so overwhelming it nearly knocked the breath from his chest. It's so loud, Molly whispered, wide-eyed, staring up at buildings taller than anything the Pride Ring had ever built, at a sky the color of nothing she had a name for since demon eyes did not usually bother distinguishing between shades of blue. It's so bright, Izuku whispered back, and found, to his own surprise, that his eyes were stinging, not from the sunlight but from something closer to joy. They found a small apartment in Muzitafu, arranged in advance through channels that Charlie had spent months quietly assembling, human paperwork and human names, and a human landlord who never once suspected that his two newest tenants were, respectively, the adopted son of Hell's royal family and a shark demon wearing a very carefully knotted scarf. Charlie could not stay, not permanently, not with an entire kingdom of the damned still requiring her attention on the other side of that basement mirror, but she visited more often than either of the children expected, slipping through in the quiet hours, and Vaggie, fiercer and more stubborn than either of them had anticipated, arranged her own affairs so that she could remain in the human world for long stretches at a time, officially listed on Izuku's paperwork as his guardian, unofficially serving as the fixed point around which both children's new lives began to orbit. It was in that first month in Muzutafu, sitting cross-legged on the floor of their small living room in front of a television neither of them had ever properly understood before, that Izuku saw All Might for the first time. The footage was grainy, some years old already, a broadcast recap of a rescue during a building collapse, but the effect on Izuku was instant and total. He watched a man built like a mountain wade through fire and rubble with a grin so wide and so genuinely, uncomplicatedly joyful that it seemed impossible anyone could smile like that while doing something so dangerous. He watched him pull an entire family out from beneath a collapsed stairwell, watched him set them down gently, watched him turn to the cameras and declare, in a booming voice that cracked with static through the old television speakers, that everything was fine now, because he was here. That's him, Izuku breathed, pressing both hands flat against the screen the way he'd once pressed them against the basement mirror. Molly, that's him. That's what I want to be. Molly, curled up beside him with her chin propped on her knees, watched the screen with her black eyes reflecting the flickering footage, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, he's not even using his hands right. Look at his form when he lands. That's going to wreck his knees eventually. Izuku turned to stare at her, half laughing despite himself. That is not the point, Molly. I know it's not the point, she said, grinning that shark's grin of hers, but somebody's gotta be the practical one, and it's clearly not going to be you. Chapter 4. The years that followed folded into each other the way years tend to for children with somewhere they are trying to go. Izuku filled notebook after notebook with observations on heroes, on quirks, on the mechanics of movement and impact and how a body without any special power at all might still find a way to matter in a world built for the extraordinary. Molly filled her own margins in those same notebooks, correcting his calculations, adding blunt practical notes beside his sprawling enthusiastic theories, because where Izuku dreamed in grand sweeping possibilities, Molly had always thought in terms of what actually worked. School was not easy for either of them, though it was not easy in very different ways. Izuku, quirkless in a classroom full of children whose powers had already begun manifesting in small, showy bursts, learned quickly to keep his head down and his hopes quieter than he wanted to. There was a boy in his class, loud and explosive both in temperament and in quirk, who took a particular interest in tormenting him, the same old cruelty from the pride ring wearing a new, human-shaped face. Katsuki Bakugo did not know about gutters or imp children or a shark demon healer, but he had an instinct for weakness all his own, and he found Izuku's dream of heroism, quirkless and stubborn as it was, to be an irresistible target. You really think Deku's gonna be some kinda hero? Bakugo sneered once, cornering him by the lockers, the nickname landing with the particular cruelty of a boy who knew exactly which word would sting the most, when you can't even do anything? Quit dreaming and know your place. Molly was not in Izuku's class that year, an accident of scheduling that Vaggie had fought and lost, but she found out about it within the hour, the way she always found out about things, and by the following morning Bakugo discovered, to his considerable and vocal outrage, that the quiet transfer girl with the strange gray pallor and the scarf she never took off had somehow arranged to have every single one of their shared classes changed so that she now sat 2 seats behind Izuku in every subject they had in common. You don't gotta do that, Izuku muttered, embarrassed and grateful in equal measure, as she settled into the seat behind him on her first day in his homeroom. I know I don't gotta, Molly said, echoing words from years and a whole world away, and the familiarity of it settled something in his chest that had been rattling loose since the locker incident. Doesn't mean I'm not going to. Bakugo, to his very evident frustration, found that whatever intimidation tactics worked on other children simply slid off Molly like water off her own scales. She did not raise her voice at him. She did not threaten him with claws or fire because she had neither. She simply looked at him, level and unbothered, with black eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, and let her reputation, quietly built over a handful of incidents that had left the school nurse thoroughly confused about a student who apparently healed faster than anyone she had ever treated, do the talking for her. It was not enough to stop Bakugo entirely. Nothing, in those years, seemed capable of fully stopping Bakugo, whose anger at the world seemed to burn hotter the more anyone tried to smother it. But it was enough, most days, to give Izuku just a little more room to breathe, a little more space to keep dreaming without the dream getting kicked out of him before it had a chance to grow. At home, in the small apartment that Baggy had slowly, stubbornly made feel like a real home despite her frequent absences for matters in hell that she never fully explained to either child, the two of them trained. It began almost as a joke, a way to fill afternoons after school while they waited for Baggy to return from whatever business had called her away, but it grew, as most things between them tended to grow, into something neither of them had quite planned but both of them needed. Izuku ran laps around the block until his lungs burned, because even without a quirk, he reasoned, All Might had needed a body strong enough to survive the forces his power put it through, and if Izuku ever found a way to matter as a hero, quirk or no quirk, his body would need to be ready for it. Molly ran beside him, not because she needed the conditioning nearly as much, her demon physiology handling exertion with an ease that made Izuku faintly jealous, but because she had made a promise on a rooftop under false stars years ago and had never once considered breaking it. She also, more usefully, spent long hours experimenting with the exact boundaries of her own quirk, something she had never had much reason to do back in the Pride Ring, where healing had always simply been treated as a lesser curiosity rather than a tool worth refining. She discovered she could accelerate the mending of bruises and small cuts almost instantly, that broken bones took longer and cost her more, leaving her drained and shaky if she pushed too hard too fast, and that the deepest, oldest hurts, the kind that lived in a person's mind rather than their body, did not respond to her power at all, no matter how badly she wished they would. I wish I could fix that too, she admitted once, quietly, after a particularly bad day where Izuku had come home from school with no visible wound at all but had barely spoken through dinner, weighed down by something Bakugo had said that had nothing to do with bruises. The stuff that doesn't bleed. I don't know how to touch that kind of hurt. You do, though, Izuku said, surprising her, looking up from where he'd been picking at his food. You don't have to heal it. You just have to be here. That's the part that actually helps. Molly did not have a response for that, not right away, and for once it was Izuku who reached across the small kitchen table and squeezed her hand, the way she had squeezed his so many times before, small hands grown slightly less small, still fitting together in exactly the same way they always had. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, between the running and the studying and the long nights spent poring over hero rankings and quirk analysis, something else had been quietly growing too, something neither of them had a name for yet and neither of them felt any particular hurry to name. It was there in the way Molly always sat close enough that their shoulders touched, in the way Izuku had started keeping a small collection of the shells she liked, sea glass and smooth stones he found on the rare trips they took to the coast, in the easy, unspoken certainty that whatever came next, they would face it standing shoulder to shoulder, exactly as they always had. Neither of them said anything about it. There would be time for that later, they seemed to silently agree, without ever actually discussing it. For now there was too much else to focus on. There was a whole hero course to get into, an entrance exam waiting somewhere on the horizon like a mountain neither of them had yet learned the shape of, and a promise, older than either of them fully remembered making, that they intended to keep no matter what stood in the way. Chapter 5. The letter arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, plain and unassuming in its envelope, and it took Izuku a full 10 seconds of staring at the return address before his brain caught up with what he was holding. UA High School. Entrance examination notice. His hand shook badly enough that Molly had to take it from him and read the first line out loud herself before either of them quite believed it was real. The exam itself, when it finally arrived weeks later, was nothing like either of them had imagined, and also somehow exactly what they should have expected from a school built around the philosophy that heroism was best tested under real pressure rather than in a quiet classroom. The written portion passed in a blur of careful, practiced focus, years of notebooks and studying finally paying off in the particular, satisfying click of a question meeting an answer he actually knew. It was the practical exam that Izuku had lain awake dreading for months, the one where actual quirks would be tested against actual robotic villains in a mock city built for exactly that purpose, the one where a boy with no quirk at all would have to find some way to matter among hundreds of applicants who did not share that particular disadvantage. He had a plan, of sorts, cobbled together from years of studying the mechanics of the field rather than the mechanics of any specific power. Speed. Positioning. An old baseball glove reinforced with metal plating that Baggy had helped him modify late one night after he'd explained, haltingly, exactly what he intended to try. It was not a hero's plan. It was the plan of a boy who had spent his whole life being told he had nothing to work with, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that nothing was simply a different kind of starting point. Molly's exam took her to a different testing site entirely, some administrative quirk of the sprawling entrance process splitting the two of them apart for the first time in longer than either could remember, and Izuku found himself standing in the crowd of nervous applicants at his own site with an unfamiliar hollow feeling where her presence usually sat at his shoulder. He told himself it was fine. He told himself he had trained for this, that he did not need her standing beside him to make his body do what he had drilled it to do 1,000 times over on quiet apartment mornings. He told himself a lot of things, in the minutes before the gates opened, and none of them stopped his hands from shaking. Then the gates opened, and there was no more time to think about anything at all. The mock city exploded into motion the instant the horn sounded, applicants scattering in every direction, quirks flaring to life in bursts of fire and light and sudden inhuman speed all around him, and Izuku ran, not toward the nearest robot but past it, toward the ones further in, the ones the flashier competitors hadn't reached yet, exactly as he'd planned. He used the glove to redirect a robot's swinging arm into a wall instead of trying to block it outright, used his own smaller size to duck through gaps that larger, more powerful classmates couldn't fit through, used every scrap of the years of study that had once seemed, to everyone but Molly, like a strange and useless hobby for a boy with nothing to actually use it for. It was not enough, not entirely. 3/4 of the way through the exam, scrambling to reposition after disabling his 9th small robot, Izuku misjudged a gap between two collapsing storefronts and felt his ankle twist badly beneath him, pain shooting white-hot up his leg as he went down hard against the pavement, and for one terrible, breathless second he thought that was it, that the whole plan, the whole years-long dream, was going to end face down on cracked concrete because of a single mistimed step. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, half expecting a robot, and found instead a very familiar, very unimpressed pair of black eyes staring down at him. "You," Molly said, crouching beside him with the scarf she'd worn all through their school years nowhere in sight, her fin bare and gleaming under the exam site's harsh overhead lights, "are the single most predictable person I have ever met." "Molly, what?" Izuku gasped through the pain, bewildered. "This isn't even your site, how did you?" "Finished early," she said simply, already pressing her palm flat against his swelling ankle, warmth spreading through the joint in a wave that made him gasp again for an entirely different reason as the pain receded almost instantly. "Then I asked real nice if I could come find you, since apparently they let finished applicants roam a little if they don't cause trouble. Turns out being polite gets you surprisingly far." "Who knew? You could get disqualified for interfering." "I'm not interfering," Molly said, standing and hauling him up by the arm with a strength that still, after all these years, managed to surprise him. "I'm healing an injury sustained during a legitimate exam attempt. Completely allowed, actually. I checked the rules twice before I came looking for you, because unlike some people I actually read things all the way through." She shoved him gently but firmly back toward the fray, her grin sharp and bright and utterly familiar. "Now go finish what you started. I didn't fly across an entire exam site to watch you sit on the ground feeling sorry for yourself." He went. Ankle whole again, breath ragged but steady, he threw himself back into the last stretch of the exam with something that felt less like desperation now and more like certainty, and when the final horn sounded across the mock city, he was still standing, glove-dented, uniform torn, but standing, exactly the way he had promised himself he would be. They found each other again outside the exam gates afterward, both of them scraped and exhausted and grinning despite themselves, and neither one said very much about what had just happened, because there did not seem to be words quite big enough for it yet. Instead Molly simply bumped her shoulder against his, the same gesture from a rooftop under false stars so many years ago, and Izuku bumped back, and together they walked away from the mock city toward whatever waited next, exactly as they always had. The acceptance letters, when they came weeks later, arrived on the very same day, addressed to two very different-sounding names at the very same small apartment, and Vaggie, opening the door to find both children standing frozen on the doorstep with matching envelopes clutched in their hands, did not need to ask what was inside before she pulled them both into the fiercest hug either of them had ever felt from her. Somewhere across a basement mirror in a city that never saw true daylight, Charlie Morningstar felt something settle warmly in her chest the moment the news reached her, an old and worn hope finally beginning, after all these years, to take its first real shape. Her son was going to UA. And whatever waited for him there, however far the road still stretched ahead, he would not be walking it alone. Chapter 6. UA on the first morning of the school year looked exactly like the pictures in the brochures and nothing at all like Izuku had actually imagined it would feel to stand in front of. The main building rose up out of its courtyard in great sweeping curves of glass and steel, and the closer he and Molly got to it, walking together through a stream of other nervous new students, the harder it became for either of them to pretend they weren't just a little bit terrified. "You're doing the thing," Molly said, not looking at him, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the entrance gates. "What thing?" "The thing where you mutter under your breath so fast it stops being actual words." She bumped his shoulder with hers, the old familiar gesture, grounding in a way that had nothing to do with her quirk. "Breathe, Izuku. We got in. That part's done. Now we just have to not immediately embarrass ourselves in front of everyone." "That's a very low bar," Izuku muttered, and she snorted, sharp-toothed and entirely unbothered, and something in his chest loosened just enough to let him walk through the front doors without his knees locking up entirely. Class 1A, when they finally found the right room, was already half full of students who all seemed, in their own individual ways, to be radiating the exact same mixture of excitement and barely contained nerves that Izuku felt humming under his own skin. A boy with unusually sharp teeth was arguing cheerfully with a girl whose skin had a faint pink cast to it. A quiet boy near the back sat with his hands folded and his eyes closed, either meditating or already asleep, it was hard to tell which. Near the window, unmistakable even from across the room, sat a shock of familiar ash-blonde hair and a permanent, simmering scowl. "Of course he's in our class," Molly murmured, following Izuku's gaze to where Bakugo sat radiating quiet menace at absolutely nobody in particular. The universe really does have a sense of humor. They found seats together, out of habit more than any real plan, and Izuku had just enough time to catch his breath and start cataloging the room the way he cataloged everything, quirk by quirk, quiet observation filling in around the edges of a notebook he'd already half filled before the first bell even rang, when the classroom door slid open with a force that nearly took it off its track. The man who stepped through wore what looked, at first glance, like an enormous yellow sleeping bag, and introduced himself, in a voice flat enough to strip paint, as their homeroom teacher. Within minutes of that introduction, Izuku found himself standing on an outdoor field alongside the entire rest of Class 1A, being informed that their very first assignment of their very first day would be a full quirk assessment test, and that whoever placed dead last across all the events would be expelled on the spot. It should have terrified him more than it did. A year ago, maybe even a few months ago, it might have. But Izuku had spent years now building a body and a mind that did not need a quirk to be useful, had spent years with Molly at his shoulder proving, over and over, that strength could look like 100 different things, and when it came time for the softball throw, when every other quirk-enhanced arm around him sent their ball soaring into the impossible distance while his own arm, entirely ordinary, waited its turn, he did not feel the cold drop of dread he might once have expected. He used the same mechanical reasoning that had carried him through the entrance exam, borrowed motion and leverage instead of raw quirk power, through with the whole disciplined weight of his trained body rather than any special gift, and watched the little device on his wrist click out a number that, while nowhere near the top of the class, was very clearly not the bottom either. Beside him, Molly's throw sent the ball sailing out on a current of water she pulled seemingly from nowhere, a wet, glimmering arc that had several of their classmates turning to stare, and when she caught his eye afterward she only shrugged, unbothered by the attention in the exact same way she had always been unbothered by attention. By the end of the day, exhausted, sunburned, and thoroughly wrung out from an assessment that had tested every last inch of what both of them could do, they sat together on the front steps of the main building, waiting for Vaggie to pick them up, watching the last stragglers of Class 1A trickle out toward the gates. "We're actually here," Izuku said quietly, still not quite able to believe it, turning his UA student handbook over and over in his hands like it might disappear if he stopped looking at it. "After everything. The gutter, and the mirror, and all of it. We're actually here." "Told you I was coming," Molly said, leaning her head against his shoulder, Finn catching the last of the afternoon light, teeth flashing in an easy, satisfied grin. "I don't break promises. Not even the ones I made when I was 4 and didn't fully understand what I was agreeing to." Izuku laughed, the sound coming easier than it had in years, and for one long, quiet moment neither of them said anything else at all, content simply to sit together on the steps of the school that had once seemed as impossibly distant as the bright world beyond a basement mirror, and let the promise, finally, properly begun, settle into something that felt, at long last, like the truth. Somewhere ahead of them lay a hero course built to test them both in ways neither the Pride Ring nor an ordinary human middle school ever could. Somewhere ahead of them lay classmates who did not yet know the truth of where either of them had come from, teachers who would push them harder than they had ever been pushed, and dangers that neither a shark demon's healing hands nor a quirkless boy's borrowed strength could fully prepare them for. But for now there was only the warmth of the afternoon sun, the solid, familiar weight of Molly's shoulder against his, and the quiet, steady certainty that whatever came next, they would meet it exactly as they always had. Together. Chapter 7. The first real trouble came not from a villain or a training exercise but from the far more mundane threat of a school corridor at lunchtime, 3 days into their first week, when a small crowd gathered outside Class 1A's door to gawk at the girl who had thrown a softball on a wave of seawater conjured from nothing at all. "Where'd you even learn to control it like that?" a boy from Class 1B asked, not unkindly, but with the blunt curiosity of a teenager who had never learned the art of not staring. "My cousin's got a water quirk and he can barely fill a cup without soaking the table." "Practice," Molly said simply, which was true enough, though it left out the part where most of that practice had taken place in a world with an entirely different sky. She had spent years since their crossing quietly discovering that her demon physiology, freed from hell's dry red haze and dropped into a world with actual oceans and actual rain, responded to water in ways she had never fully understood back in the Pride Ring. It was, Vaggie had theorized late one evening after watching Molly accidentally summon a small localized rainstorm over their kitchen sink while doing dishes, quite possibly the true shape of a demon quirk finally waking up somewhere it could breathe. Not everyone in the crowd was so easily satisfied with a one-word answer. Near the back, half hidden by taller students, a girl Izuku did not recognize watched Molly with an expression that had nothing friendly in it at all, arms crossed, mouth twisted into something that reminded him, uncomfortably, of every sneering demon child he had ever known back in the ring. "Healing and water," the girl said, just loud enough to carry. "Kind of a boring combo for a hero course, isn't it? No offense, but neither one of those is exactly going to take down a villain." The crowd's easy curiosity soured a little at the edges, a few uncertain laughs rippling through it, the way cruelty sometimes disguised itself as humor when it needed cover. Izuku felt his stomach drop, old familiar dread rising up out of a place he'd thought he'd left behind in a different world entirely, and he opened his mouth to say something, anything, before he'd even fully decided what. Molly beat him to it, unbothered as ever, tilting her head at the girl with an expression that was somehow both perfectly pleasant and entirely unimpressed. "Funny," she said. "I've healed 3 different training injuries just this week, including yours, actually, when you twisted your wrist in gym on Tuesday and didn't want to admit it in front of your friends. And water puts out fires, floods rooms, disarms people without breaking a single bone. But sure, boring." She shrugged, turning back toward her own friends with the easy dismissal of someone who had spent an entire childhood learning exactly how little other people's opinions of her quirk actually mattered. "Some of us would rather be the reason people survive than the reason they get hurt in the first place. Different priorities, I guess." The girl went red, opened her mouth, found nothing to say, and retreated into the crowd, which dispersed shortly afterward with the particular speed of an audience that had come for a spectacle and found something far less entertaining instead. Izuku, watching the whole exchange, felt something in his chest that was half pride and half the same old helpless gratitude he'd carried since he was 4 years old in a gutter. "You didn't have to defend yourself like that," he said quietly, once the hallway had cleared. "You could have just ignored her." "I could have," Molly agreed, unwrapping a rice ball from her bag with the same unbothered calm she'd carried through the entire confrontation. "But ignoring people like that just teaches them they were right to say it in the first place. Better to make it very clear, very early, that it's not going to work." She glanced at him sideways, something softer creeping into her expression. "Same reason I never let anybody get away with calling you Deku like it was an insult, back when Bakugo first started it. Words matter. Might as well decide what they mean before somebody else decides it for you." It was a lesson Izuku turned over in his mind for days afterward, long after the incident itself had faded into the ordinary background noise of a first week full of new names and new routines. He thought about it during their first proper hero training exercise, a mock battle scenario that paired students off in teams of 2, heroes against villains, and found himself standing in a stairwell beside a nervous, invisible classmate, trying to explain a strategy built entirely around positioning and misdirection rather than raw power, and realized, somewhere in the middle of the explanation, that he was doing exactly what Molly had described. Deciding, on his own terms, what his own lack of a flashy quirk actually meant, instead of letting anyone else decide it for him first. They did not win that particular exercise, not cleanly, but Izuku's plan held together long enough to corner the opposing team's core into a position their instructor later admitted, with visible reluctance, was cleverer than most of the class had managed all day. And when Molly caught his eye across the training ground afterward, grinning that same shark's grin that had never once changed in all the years he'd known her, he understood, with a clarity that settled somewhere deep and permanent in his chest, that whatever the rest of this hero course asked of him, whatever villains or trials or impossible odds still waited somewhere further down the road, he was not walking toward any of it as the same small, broken boy who had once bled quietly in a gutter and believed himself worth nothing at all. He was walking toward it as someone Molly had spent a lifetime helping build, one healed wound and one fierce, unwavering promise at a time, and for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, that felt like more than enough to start with. Chapter 8. That evening, back in the small apartment that had slowly become as much a home to both of them as anywhere in hell had ever been, Baggy set down 3 plates at the kitchen table and studied the two of them with the sharp, assessing look she had never quite managed to soften, even after all these years of practice. "You both look like you got run through a wall," she said. "Training exercise," Izuku offered, around a mouthful of rice. "It was good, though. Really good." "He almost won," Molly added, with the particular pride of someone bragging on another person's behalf far more comfortably than she would ever have bragged about her own achievements. "Cornered the whole other team with basically nothing but a stairwell and some really aggressive vocabulary." Baggy's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a full smile she usually allowed herself before she'd had her evening tea, and she reached across the table to flick a stray grain of rice off Izuku's collar with the same brisk, unshowy affection she'd carried since the very first night they'd claimed him as family. "Your mother wants to hear all of it," she said. "She's been pacing the hotel lobby half the day waiting for an update, if you can believe that. Ruler of an entire kingdom of the damned, and she's fretting over a softball throw." "Tell her I got a decent score," Izuku said, smiling despite the ache still settled deep in his shoulders. "Tell her we're okay. Both of us." "Tell her yourself," Baggy said, already pulling a small mirror shard from her pocket, one of the portable fragments Charlie had enchanted years ago for exactly these moments, its surface beginning to ripple faintly the moment it caught the kitchen light. "She'll want to see your face when you say it." Later, after the mirror shard had gone dark again and the dishes had been cleared and Baggy had retreated to the small back room she used as her own, Izuku found Molly out on the apartment's narrow balcony, leaning against the railing, watching the ordinary human city sprawl out beneath them in a wash of electric light that no false pride ring star had ever managed to imitate. "Can't sleep either," he said, joining her at the railing. "Too much happened today," Molly said, not looking away from the skyline. "Good too much, though. Not the bad kind." "Good too much," Izuku agreed, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, content simply to stand shoulder to shoulder in the cool evening air, two children of hell grown taller and stronger and stubbornly, improbably hopeful, staring out at a world that had once seemed as distant and unreachable as a story told to pass the time in a gutter behind an old cathedral district. Whatever waited for them within the walls of UA, whatever trials the coming months would bring, they had already proven, 100 times over since that very first afternoon, that they intended to face every last bit of it exactly the way they always had. Together. Chapter 9. The first real taste of what a hero course actually asked of its students came not in the form of a villain or a crisis but in the far more mundane shape of a costume request form, handed out by their homeroom teacher with the flat, unceremonious instruction to describe, in as much detail as they wanted, exactly what kind of hero they intended to become. Izuku stared at the blank space on his form for the better part of an hour that evening, pencil hovering, notebook open beside him for reference, and found himself circling back, again and again, to a single stubborn problem. Every costume he sketched seemed built around a quirk he did not have, some flashy accommodation for a power that would never arrive no matter how long he waited for it, and each time he caught himself doing it he had to cross the whole page out and start again. "You're overthinking it," Molly said, glancing over from where she was sprawled on the floor of their apartment's living room, her own form already half filled in with a design that made surprisingly practical use of a lightweight wetsuit material and a set of small vents along the forearms. "You don't need a costume built around a power you don't have. You need one built around what you actually do. Speed. Positioning. Taking a hit and getting back up." "That doesn't sound very heroic," Izuku admitted. "All Might doesn't wear a costume built around his quirk either," Molly pointed out, not unreasonably. "He wears a costume built around looking like he means it. That's the actual trick. You've been running around a mock city dodging robots with nothing but a modified baseball glove and pure stubbornness for 2 exams straight. Design around that. Something that protects your joints, something with grip, something that doesn't get in the way when you're vaulting over half a collapsed building." It was, Izuku reflected later, exactly the kind of blunt, practical advice that Molly had been handing him since they were 4 years old, and exactly the kind of advice he needed most whenever his own mind ran too far ahead of his good sense. He redesigned the costume that night from the ground up, built it around reinforced boots and knee guards, a lightweight but sturdy jacket with pockets for exactly the kind of small emergency supplies a support quirk-minded hero might overlook, and a mask that covered just enough of his face to feel, for the first time, a little bit like armor rather than a costume. Molly's own design, when it came back from the support department a week later, drew a fair amount of attention on its first fitting day, not for flashiness but for the sheer quiet cleverness of it. A sleek, dark blue bodysuit that let her fin sit unhindered along her spine instead of trying to hide it, small retractable fins along her forearms that the support engineers had built after several long consultation sessions about the exact mechanics of how she pulled water toward her, and a face covering that left her mouth free, because, as she'd informed the bewildered support staff with total seriousness, half her intimidation factor came from being able to smile properly at people. "You look terrifying," Izuku told her honestly, the first time she modeled it in full. "Good," Molly said, baring every one of her teeth in a grin that the costume did absolutely nothing to soften. "That's the whole idea." Their first week in costume came alongside their first real taste of foundational hero studies, a class that turned out to mean something considerably more hands-on than either of them had expected from the name alone. All Might himself, to Izuku's barely contained astonishment, taught the course, arriving to their very first session in a burst of golden light and sheer overwhelming presence that had half the class visibly starstruck and the other half doing a poor job of hiding that they were. "Today," All Might announced, grinning that same enormous, unshakable grin Izuku had watched 1,000 times on old grainy footage, now standing close enough that Izuku could hardly believe it was real, "we begin the true work of becoming heroes. Rescue. Combat. And most importantly, teamwork, because no hero, however powerful, saves the world alone." Izuku found himself paired, that first session, not with Molly but with the quiet, gravity-defying boy who sat near the back of their classroom, a pairing decided by lottery rather than any particular design, and though some small stubborn part of him wished for the easy comfort of a familiar partner, he found, working through the exercise, that there was something valuable in learning to trust a stranger's power just as readily as he trusted Molly's. It was a lesson, he suspected, that a hero course meant to teach on purpose. Real disasters would not always hand you a partner you already knew how to read. Molly, paired that same session with a boy whose quirk let him harden any part of his body at will, found her own version of the same lesson, learning to time her water manipulation around his shifting defenses instead of her usual instinct to simply react to Izuku's movements the way she'd been doing since they were children. It was strange, in a small quiet way, to spend an exercise apart from him for the first time in longer than either of them could properly remember, and stranger still to realize, at the end of it, that she had managed just fine. Weird, right? She said afterward, as they walked home together in the fading afternoon light, tired in the particular satisfied way that came from actually earning a day's exhaustion rather than just surviving it. Doing it without you standing right there. A little, Izuku admitted. Good weird, though. I think we both needed to know we could. Molly considered that for a moment, then bumped her shoulder against his, same as always. Doesn't mean I like it, she said. Just means I can survive it if I have to. Chapter 10. 3 weeks into their first term, Class 1A was informed, with the particular brisk understatement their homeroom teacher favored for announcements of any real significance, that they would be spending the following Thursday at a facility called the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, a rescue training site built to simulate exactly the kinds of disasters real heroes might one day be called to handle. Flood zones. Collapsed buildings. Landslides. A whole miniature world of manufactured catastrophe, meant to test not power but judgment, the calm, clear thinking a real crisis demanded when there was no script to follow and no guaranteed happy ending waiting at the far side of it. Izuku spent the days leading up to the trip in a state of barely restrained excitement that Molly found equal parts endearing and exhausting, filling notebook pages with theoretical rescue scenarios until she finally confiscated the notebook at dinner one evening and informed him, with the blunt affection of someone who had been managing his enthusiasm since they were 4 years old, that he was allowed to simply be excited about something without cataloging every possible variable of it. First, I like cataloging, Izuku said, a little sheepishly, reaching for the notebook, which Molly held just out of reach with the ease of someone considerably more coordinated than him. I know you do. Doesn't mean you have to do it every single second of every single day. She finally relented, sliding the notebook back across the table. Just once, try being excited about the flood simulation zone without also mentally drafting a thesis on water displacement physics. That's rich, coming from the girl who spent an entire afternoon explaining tidal mechanics to Vaggie over dinner. That's different, Molly said, entirely unbothered by the hypocrisy. I actually need that information. You're just hoarding it for fun. The morning of the trip arrived bright and unremarkable, a school bus full of nervous, chattering students winding its way out toward the training facility, and Izuku spent most of the ride with his face nearly pressed to the window, watching the city give way to open road, half listening to Molly's ongoing, deeply unimpressed commentary on a classmate's theory about which rescue scenario would be hardest. The facility itself, when they finally arrived, sprawled out below the entrance in a series of distinct disaster zones built around a central plaza, each one a small, self-contained world of manufactured chaos, and Izuku had just enough time to marvel at the sheer scale of it, at the flooded ruins and the crumbling landslide slope and the collapsed building side all visible at once from the overlook, before the air around the central plaza's fountain began to warp and darken in a way that had nothing to do with any training exercise on the day's official schedule. The dark mass unfolded slowly, almost lazily, a swirling purple void that seemed to swallow the light around it, and Izuku's stomach dropped with the sudden, unmistakable certainty that whatever was happening below them had not been part of any lesson plan. Figures began to step out of the void, one after another, more than he could easily count, and the training facility's usual calm quickly gave way to shouted warnings from their homeroom teacher, orders to stay back, to stay together, orders that most of the class, frozen in shock at the sight of actual villains materializing in what was supposed to be a controlled training exercise, took several long seconds to properly process. Izuku. Molly's hand closed around his wrist, gripped tight, fin bristling along her spine, every trace of her usual easy humor gone entirely from her voice. That's not part of the exercise. I know, he said, and found, to his own surprise, that his voice came out steadier than he expected, some old instinct from years of training kicking in beneath the fear. Stay close to me. Their teacher moved first, a blur of fabric and motion, throwing himself down into the chaos below to buy the class whatever time he could, and in the confusion that followed, in the scramble of students trying to decide whether to flee or help or simply survive the next several minutes, Izuku found himself, along with a small handful of classmates, cut off from the main group entirely, pushed by the shifting crowd toward the edge of the flood zone, where the dark portal's edges licked closest to the overlook's crumbling railing. A villain broke away from the main group below, drifting toward them with a slow, deliberate menace that made every hair on the back of Izuku's neck stand up, and beside him he felt Molly shift her weight forward, water already gathering at her fingertips in a way he had seen 100 times in training but never, until this exact moment, in genuine fear for both their lives. Whatever happens, Molly said quietly, eyes fixed on the approaching villain, don't you dare try to be a hero without me right beside you. Promise me that much. I promise, Izuku said, and meant it with the whole of a heart that had spent years learning exactly how much that particular promise was worth. Chapter 11. The villain that had broken away from the main group moved with an unhurried confidence that Izuku found more unsettling than outright aggression would have been, a lean, unassuming man in a plain dark coat who studied the handful of stranded students with the mild, clinical interest of someone assessing livestock rather than people. Beside Izuku, a girl from their class whose quirk let her create small portable pockets of gravity had gone very pale, and a boy with an insect-based quirk had positioned himself instinctively in front of the smaller members of their stranded group, though even his usual bravado had dimmed considerably in the face of an actual, undisguised threat. Not the ones I came for, the villain said, almost to himself, glancing them over with something like mild disappointment. But I suppose stragglers will do, if it slows the rest of you down enough. He moved before anyone could properly react, a sudden burst of speed that closed the distance in a way no ordinary human body should have managed, and Izuku, reacting on pure trained instinct rather than any conscious plan, shoved the nearest classmate out of the villain's path and threw himself into the gap that opened up in her place, glove already raised, years of borrowed leverage and careful positioning collapsing down into a single desperate, half-formed decision. The blow that connected against his forearm sent him skidding backward hard enough to knock the breath entirely out of his lungs, pain lancing up through his arm in a white-hot wave, and for one terrible, dizzying second the whole world narrowed down to the sound of his own ragged breathing and the villain's unhurried footsteps closing the distance again. Then Molly was there, water surging up out of the flood zone's shallow pools in a sudden, violent wall that slammed into the villain's side with enough force to send him staggering. And in the half-second of confusion that bought them, she was at Izuku's side, hands already glowing with that familiar gentle warmth, healing the worst of the damage to his arm even as she kept her eyes fixed, hard and furious, on the villain regaining his footing a few meters away. Get up, she said, low and urgent, we need to move, this isn't a fight we win standing still. Izuku got up. Whatever pain remained beneath Molly's rushed healing faded into background noise beside the sharper, more immediate fear pounding through his chest, and together, without needing to discuss a plan beyond the wordless understanding built over more than a decade of fighting on the same side, they retreated toward the collapsed building zone, using the broken terrain the way Izuku had learned to use every gap and obstacle since his very first entrance exam, drawing the villain into a stretch of unstable rubble where his speed advantage meant considerably less than it had out in the open. It was not a fight either of them won cleanly. It was, in the end, barely a fight at all, more a desperate scramble to buy time, Molly's water slowing the villain's approach just enough, Izuku's careful use of the terrain keeping them one step ahead of a blow that would have ended things badly if it had landed, until the sound of All Might's voice, booming and enormous and entirely, gloriously real, cut through the chaos of the whole facility at once, and the villain, along with every other figure that had poured out of that dark unnatural portal, turned to flee before the number one hero's arrival could reach them in full. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun, in the strange way real danger often was, all adrenaline and no time to properly process any of it until well after the fact. Izuku found himself sitting on a chunk of broken concrete afterward, hands shaking, Molly pressed close against his side with her arm looped tightly around his shoulders, neither of them saying much of anything at all, simply breathing, together, in the sudden ringing quiet that followed. You kept your promise, Molly said eventually, voice a little unsteady despite her best efforts to sound composed. So did you, Izuku said, and found, when he finally trusted his voice enough to speak, that it came out rougher than he intended, thick with everything he hadn't had time to feel until just now. Molly, I was so scared. Me too, she admitted, quietly, an honesty she rarely allowed herself in front of anyone but him. Doesn't mean we didn't do good. Just means it mattered enough to be scared about. Chapter 12. The days that followed the attack on the training facility passed in a strange, muted haze, the whole school buzzing with news coverage and official statements and a level of scrutiny neither Izuku nor Molly had fully anticipated when they first crossed through a basement mirror into a bright, ordinary world. Reporters camped outside UA's gates for the better part of a week. Parents called the school in droves demanding answers about security. And within Class 1A itself, a quiet, unspoken shift settled over the whole group, the easy nervous excitement of the first few weeks giving way to something heavier, more serious, the first real understanding that the hero course they had all signed up for was not a game with guaranteed safety nets. Vaggie, when she heard the full account from both of them that evening, said very little at first, simply pulling them both into a hug fierce enough to make Izuku's still healing ribs twinge in protest, and it was only much later, after Izuku had gone to bed and Molly had lingered in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes, that Vaggie finally spoke what had clearly been sitting heavy on her chest the entire evening. You did exactly what I hoped you would, she told Molly, quietly, in the particular careful voice she used for things that mattered too much to say lightly. Protected him. Kept your head. I know I've told you 100 times to look out for him, but I never actually wanted you to have to prove it against something that dangerous. I'm proud of you. I'm also furious it happened at all, and I need you to understand both those things can be true at once. I understand, Molly said, and for once there was no easy humor in her voice at all, just plain, tired honesty. I was furious too. Still kind of am. But I'd rather be furious and standing next to him than safe somewhere else not knowing if he was okay. Charlie, reached through the small mirror shard the following morning, had a considerably harder time keeping her composure, and it took a long while, and a great deal of reassurance from both children, before she finally settled enough to simply listen rather than immediately demand they both come home to hell where, as she put it more than once, at least she knew exactly what kind of dangers to expect. I'm not saying that to scare you, Charlie admitted eventually, her reflection in the small mirror looking uncharacteristically worn. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I promised myself a long time ago I would never lie to either of you about how frightened I get. But I also remember exactly what your face looked like the first time I showed you that mirror, Izuku, and I am not about to be the reason you give up on it now. Just. Please. Both of you. Be careful. Look out for each other the way you always have. Always, Izuku promised, and beside him Molly nodded, silent but resolute, and Charlie's tired, worried expression eased, just slightly, into something closer to the warm, steady hope she had carried for her son since the very first night she held him. School resumed its normal rhythm within a couple of weeks, though a certain hard-edged seriousness lingered beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lessons afterward, a shared understanding among the whole of Class 1A that the stakes of what they were training for had just become considerably more real. Izuku found himself training harder in the weeks that followed, not out of fear exactly, but out of a sharpened, more focused sense of purpose, and Molly, training alongside him as she always had, pushed the boundaries of her own healing quirk further than she ever had before, determined never again to feel quite so helpless in the space between a blow landing and her hands closing the damage it left behind. It was in the middle of that renewed, focused training, barely a month after the attack, that their homeroom teacher announced, with his usual flat, unceremonious delivery, the arrival of an entirely different kind of challenge on the horizon, one that had nothing to do with villains at all, and everything to do with the fact that UA's annual sports festival, the single most watched event of the entire school year, broadcast live to the whole of the nation, was scheduled to begin in a little under 6 weeks. Chapter 13. News of the sports festival landed on Class 1A with the particular electric energy of an entire room of teenagers realizing, all at once, that the thing standing between them and national recognition was now measured in weeks rather than years. Conversations in the hallway turned almost overnight from lingering, quiet unease about villain attacks to loud, competitive speculation about event formats and past champions, and even the quieter members of the class found themselves swept up, at least a little, in the restless buzz of it. "It's basically a job interview broadcast to the entire country," Molly said one evening, sprawled across the living room floor with a printout of the previous year's event schedule spread out in front of her, highlighter already in hand. "Every agency worth working for is going to be watching. Scouts. Sponsors. All of it. No pressure," Izuku said, only half joking, staring at the same printout from where he sat cross-legged beside her. "Plenty of pressure, actually," Molly said, entirely unbothered by his tone. "Might as well use it. You spent your whole life proving people wrong about what you're capable of without a flashy quirk to back you up. This is just the biggest audience you've ever had for it." It was, Izuku reflected, exactly the kind of blunt reframing he needed to hear, and over the following weeks the two of them fell into a training rhythm even more demanding than anything they had managed before, mornings spent on conditioning before school, evenings spent poring over footage of past festivals, breaking down event formats and past champion strategies with the same meticulous focus Izuku brought to every notebook he had ever filled. Their classmates, for the most part, threw themselves into their own preparations with equal intensity, and the halls of UA in the weeks leading up to the festival buzzed with an energy that felt, at times, almost like its own kind of training exercise, every casual conversation shading, sooner or later, into strategy, every lunch period a quiet battlefield of half-revealed plans and carefully guarded secrets. Bakugo, predictably, made no secret at all of his own intentions, declaring loudly and often to anyone within earshot that he intended to win outright, first place, no qualifications, and though Izuku had long since stopped letting Bakugo's aggressive confidence rattle him the way it once had, he found himself, more than once, quietly matching that same fierce determination in his own private resolve. Molly's approach to her own preparation looked, on the surface, considerably calmer than Izuku's increasingly detailed strategy notebooks, but Izuku had known her long enough to recognize the particular focused stillness she fell into when she was taking something seriously, the way her usual easy humor sharpened into something quieter and more deliberate whenever she was actually working through a problem that mattered to her. "You're doing the thing," Izuku told her one evening, echoing her own words back at her from the first day of school, watching her run through the same forearm movement for the 15th time in a row, adjusting the angle by degrees each time. "What thing?" "The thing where you go quiet and just keep repeating something until it's perfect." Molly paused, considering this, then huffed out a small laugh, the tension easing slightly from her shoulders. "Fair," she admitted. "I just keep thinking about the festival before. About how close that villain got before I managed to actually hit him with anything useful. I want better range control before I have to use this in front of the entire country instead of just a training facility nobody was watching." "You saved my life," Izuku said quietly. "Whatever your range control was that day, it was more than good enough." "I know," Molly said, and the honesty in it, free of any of her usual deflecting humor, settled warm and steady in Izuku's chest. "Doesn't mean I don't want to be even better next time. For you. For whoever else might need it someday too." It was a sentiment Izuku understood completely, because it mirrored, almost exactly, his own quiet determination driving every extra lap, every late night spent refining a strategy that still, stubbornly, had no flashy quirk to lean on. They were not training, either of them, purely for the sake of winning a festival, however much national attention it carried. They were training, as they always had, for the promise made on a rooftop under false stars so many years ago, a promise that had only grown heavier and more determined with every year, every wound, every fight that had asked more of them than the last one had. The morning of the festival arrived bright and clear, the stadium already humming with the distant roar of a crowd larger than either of them had ever stood in front of, and as they walked together toward the staging area, uniforms crisp, nerves buzzing beneath a calm neither of them entirely felt, Molly reached over and bumped her shoulder against his one last time before the gates ahead of them opened onto the biggest stage either of them had ever faced. "Together," she said, the same word it had always been, since the very first handshake in a gutter behind an old cathedral district. "Together," Izuku echoed, and side by side, they stepped out into the roar of the waiting crowd. Chapter 14. The stadium swallowed them whole the moment they stepped through the tunnel, a wall of sound and light so overwhelming that Izuku's carefully rehearsed calm nearly buckled under the weight of it, tens of thousands of voices roaring at once, cameras sweeping across the assembled first-year students in slow, deliberate arcs that would be broadcast, he knew, into homes across the entire country. Somewhere out there, watching through channels neither of them had ever fully explained to anyone at UA, he knew Charlie and Vaggie would be watching too, and the thought steadied him more than he expected it to. The opening event, announced with theatrical flourish by the festival's flamboyant announcer, turned out to be an obstacle course stretched across the full width of the stadium grounds, a chaotic sprint through a narrow tunnel packed with animatronic robots left over from the entrance exam, followed by a treacherous minefield of hidden explosive charges, followed by a final stretch across a canyon crossed only by a scattering of narrow stone pillars. Izuku's plan, formed and reformed a dozen times over the preceding weeks, hinged on exactly the same principle that had carried him through every physical test since his very first entrance exam: use the chaos, not fight it. When the starting horn sounded and the tunnel ahead exploded into a frantic crush of bodies and quirks, he did not try to force his way through the crowd. He used a burst of speed to duck low along the tunnel's edge, let faster, flashier classmates clear a path through the animatronics ahead of him, and slipped through the gaps they left behind with the same careful economy of motion that had once carried him past a twisted ankle and a collapsing storefront. Molly, a short distance ahead of him in the crush, used her own approach with a different kind of efficiency, calling up thin sheets of water from the minefield's buried sprinkler system to reveal, briefly and just clearly enough, the outline of the mines hidden beneath the sand before students further back could see them, buying herself and, deliberately, Izuku a clean path through the worst of the danger. "Cheater," Izuku called out to her, half laughing despite the burn already building in his legs, as he caught up alongside her at the canyon's edge. "Strategist," Molly corrected, already vaulting from the first stone pillar to the next with an easy, water-assisted grace that made the crossing look considerably less terrifying than it actually was. "Keep up." He kept up. By the time they broke through into the stadium's main field, the crowd's roar rising to a fresh, deafening pitch at the sight of the first runners emerging, Izuku found himself placed solidly in the middle of the pack, not first, not by a long stretch, but far from last either, and when he glanced sideways to find Molly finishing only a handful of places ahead of him, grinning fierce and sharp-toothed despite her own obvious exhaustion, he felt something in his chest settle into a solid, steady kind of pride that had nothing to do with rankings at all. Bakugo finished first, as he had loudly promised he would, blasting his way through the entire course with an aggressive, explosive efficiency that left more than a few classmates nursing minor burns, and though Izuku still felt the old familiar sting of Bakugo's contemptuous glance as he passed, it landed with considerably less weight than it once might have. There would be time, later in the festival, to prove exactly what he was capable of. For now, simply making it through with Molly at his side, both of them standing on the far end of the canyon with their names posted solidly in the qualifying ranks, felt like more than enough. Chapter 15. The second event, once the exhausted field of qualifiers had caught their breath, turned out to be a cavalry battle, teams of 2 to 4 students bound together by a length of tape, competing to steal points-worth headbands from one another across a wide-open arena, the value of each headband determined, in a twist that had the whole field groaning in unison, by each student's ranking from the previous event. Izuku, having placed solidly but not spectacularly in the obstacle course, found his own headband worth a modest but respectable sum. Bakugo's, unsurprisingly, sat at the very top of the board, worth an enormous number of points that made him, within seconds of the rankings being posted, the single most hunted target in the entire arena. "You're going to be swarmed," Molly said grimly, eyeing the scoreboard as they hurried to assemble their own team, pulling in 2 other classmates whose quirks complemented their own strategy well enough on short notice. "Everybody's going to come straight for him. Which means everybody's not going to be looking anywhere else," Izuku said, an idea already forming with the particular quick, excited clarity that Molly had learned, over years of friendship, to recognize as the exact moment his brain had outpaced his mouth. "We don't need to fight for the big prizes. We just need to pick off the smaller, undefended teams while everyone's busy fighting over Bakugo." It was, in the end, exactly the strategy that got them through the first half of the event relatively unscathed, ducking along the arena's edges while chaos erupted in the center where half the field converged on Bakugo's team in a furious, explosive scramble, picking up small but steady point totals from teams too distracted by the main event to properly defend their own headbands. It nearly cost them everything in the final minutes, when a team they had underestimated, quiet and unassuming until that exact moment, sprang a coordinated ambush that very nearly stripped their entire accumulated total in one sharp, decisive strike. Molly's water, called up fast and hard from a nearby fountain feature built into the arena's terrain, bought them the half-second they needed to pull back out of range, and Izuku, thinking fast, used the last of their team's mobility to duck their headband out of reach entirely, tucking it low against his chest and letting their two teammates form a protective wall around him for the final 10 seconds before the horn sounded. They finished the event solidly in the middle of the pack, not spectacular, not embarrassing, and when the horn finally sounded and the exhausted teams began to disperse, Izuku caught Molly's eye across the chaos and found her already grinning at him, breathless and thrilled despite the ache visibly settling into her shoulders. "Told you the small strategy would work," he said. "You did," Molly agreed. "Don't let it go to your head. We still got ambushed at the end because somebody," she added, poking him firmly in the chest, "got so excited about the plan working that he forgot to watch our flank." "That's fair," Izuku admitted, laughing despite the exhaustion, and together they made their way toward the stands to catch their breath before the day's final event, the one that both of them, if they were honest, had been quietly dreading and anticipating in equal measure since the festival's schedule was first announced. The one-on-one tournament bracket, where strategy alone would no longer be enough to hide behind, and every remaining competitor would have to stand, eventually, entirely on their own. Chapter 16. The bracket, posted on a massive screen above the stadium field to a fresh wave of roaring anticipation from the crowd, placed Izuku's first match against a broad-shouldered boy from Class 1B whose quirk let him generate short bursts of concentrated force from his palms, a power considerably more straightforward and considerably more dangerous than anything Izuku had faced in either of the day's earlier events. Molly's own bracket placed her, to the visible delight of the crowd once the pairing was announced, against a boy from their own class whose hardening quirk had given her considerable trouble during a training exercise weeks earlier, an old rival matchup that had the commentators already speculating loudly about which of the two would come out on top. "Guess we're both about to find out the hard way," Molly said, watching the bracket with an expression that mixed genuine focus with the faintest edge of nerves she rarely let show this openly. "You've got this," Izuku said, with the total, uncomplicated certainty of someone who had spent his entire life watching her prove people wrong about exactly what she was capable of. "So do you," she said, squeezing his hand once, briefly, before the announcer's voice boomed out across the stadium calling the first match of the day. "Go show them what all that stubborn strategy of yours is actually good for." His match came first, and it was, by a wide margin, the hardest fight Izuku had faced since the day the villain's fist had connected with his forearm at the training facility, his opponent's force blasts closing distance and cutting off retreat with a raw power Izuku had no equivalent quirk to counter directly. He fell back on every scrap of study and training he had ever accumulated instead, reading the rhythm of his opponent's attacks, timing his own movements to the narrow windows between each blast, using the arena's uneven terrain the way he had once used a collapsing mock city. And though the match pushed him further than any single fight in his life so far, though he ended it with his whole body aching and his opponent's final, desperate blast catching him hard enough across the shoulder to leave a bruise that would take Molly a full 10 minutes to properly heal afterward, he ended it standing, and his opponent, exhausted and out of options, did not. The crowd's roar at the ring-out call washed over him in a wave that left his ears ringing, and it was only when he limped off the field, adrenaline finally beginning to fade, that he fully registered the astonished, delighted expression on his classmates' faces waiting for him at the edge of the arena, and the particular fierce, blazing pride on Molly's, already jogging toward him with her hands glowing warm before she'd even fully reached his side. "You beat him," she said, half laughing, half scolding, healing the worst of his bruises with hands that shook slightly from her own residual adrenaline. "You absolute idiot, you actually beat him. I nearly had a heart attack watching that last blast almost take your head off." "Had to give the crowd something to talk about," Izuku said, breathless and grinning despite the exhaustion dragging at every muscle in his body. Her own match, called shortly after, proved every bit as demanding as his had been, her opponent's hardened defense forcing her to abandon her usual reliance on sheer water pressure in favor of a slower, more precise approach, wearing down small unguarded gaps in his defense one careful strike at a time rather than trying to overpower him outright. It took the better part of 15 minutes, longer than any other match of the day, both competitors visibly exhausted by the end of it, before Molly finally found the opening she needed, a narrow gap at her opponent's ankle where a sustained, focused jet of water finally swept his footing out from under him entirely, sending him tumbling out of the ring to a fresh eruption of noise from the crowd. Izuku met her at the edge of the arena the moment the match ended, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply standing together in the exhausted, ringing aftermath of a day that had asked more of both of them than either had fully anticipated, until Molly finally broke the silence with a tired, satisfied laugh. "We're both still standing," she said. "That's more than I actually expected, if I'm being honest." "We're always still standing," Izuku said, echoing an old promise that had carried them from a gutter behind an old cathedral district all the way to the roaring heart of a stadium neither of them could have imagined as children. That's kind of the whole point. Chapter 17. Neither of them won the tournament outright. Izuku's semi-final match, against a classmate whose quirk manipulated gravity with an unpredictable, disorienting versatility that no amount of careful terrain reading could fully counter, ended in a hard-fought, narrow loss that left him more frustrated with himself than he expected, replaying every decision in the match over and over on the walk back to the stands even as his classmates offered genuine, warm congratulations for having made it as far as he had. Molly's own semi-final, against a fire quirk user whose sheer raw output eventually overwhelmed her water's ability to keep pace, ended in a similarly close, hard-fought defeat, and the two of them found each other afterward in the quiet space beneath the stands, both nursing the particular ache of a fight given everything and still not quite enough. "We didn't win," Izuku said, staring at his own hands, still faintly trembling with the aftermath of a match he could not stop turning over in his mind. "No," Molly agreed. "We didn't. I thought I'd feel worse about that." Molly considered this, leaning back against the concrete wall beside him, her own exhaustion written plainly across her face despite the healing already smoothing over the worst of her own bruises. "Bakugo's gonna win the whole thing," she said, with the flat, practical certainty of someone who had watched enough of the bracket to see exactly where it was heading. "He's been building toward this since we were kids in the same homeroom, screaming about being the best. Doesn't mean either of us lost today. We both made it further than half the field. We both stood our ground against people whose quirks should have made this a lot easier for them than it was." "I know," Izuku said, and found, turning it over, that he genuinely did know it, that the frustration sitting in his chest was not really about the loss itself but about the particular, familiar ache of wanting, always, to be a little more than he currently was, a feeling he suspected he would carry, in one form or another, for the rest of his life. "I guess I just wanted to prove something to everyone watching. That quirkless doesn't mean useless." "You already proved that," Molly said, quiet and certain, nudging her shoulder against his. "You proved it the second you walked off that arena on your own 2 feet after taking a full-force blast to the shoulder. You proved it every single day since we were 4 years old and some idiot in the pride ring decided you weren't worth anything." "The scoreboard doesn't actually decide that, Izuku." "It never did." He let that settle for a long moment, the noise of the stadium above them dulled to a distant, muffled roar, and found, somewhere in the quiet space beneath the stands with Molly's shoulder warm against his, that the sharp edge of his own disappointment had softened into something closer to simple, tired pride. "Together," he said finally, echoing the word that had carried them through every year since a gutter and a handshake too strong for small hands. "Together," Molly agreed, and above them, muffled through concrete and cheering crowds, the festival's final match roared on toward its inevitable conclusion, leaving the two of them exactly where they had always found themselves in the end. Side by side, undefeated in the only way that had ever truly mattered to either of them, with a whole long road still stretching out ahead. Chapter 18. The days after the festival settled into a strange, quiet lull, the whole of Class 1A adjusting to a fresh wave of public attention that came with having performed, however successfully or unsuccessfully, in front of an audience of millions. Izuku found himself the subject of more than a few online clips, his match against the Force Blast wielder replayed and dissected by commentators who seemed endlessly fascinated by the idea of a quirkless student holding his ground so far into the tournament, and though the attention made him faintly uncomfortable in a way he struggled to properly articulate, Molly had no such trouble putting words to it on his behalf. "They keep calling it inspiring," she said one evening, scrolling through a tablet Vaggie had reluctantly allowed into the apartment despite her general distrust of human technology, her mouth twisted in faint, familiar irritation. "Like your entire life has to exist as some kind of lesson for other people instead of just being your actual life." "It doesn't bother me that much," Izuku said, though the slight furrow in his brow suggested otherwise, the same tell she had learned to read years ago, long before either of them had cameras or commentators to worry about at all. "It bothers you plenty," Molly said, setting the tablet aside entirely, fixing him with the particular direct look she reserved for moments she thought he was underselling his own feelings. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't just because the attention's mostly positive this time instead of mostly cruel like it used to be. Both kinds can wear on a person." He did not have a ready argument against that, mostly because she was, as she so often was, entirely correct, and instead of arguing he simply let the conversation lapse into comfortable silence, the two of them settling into the familiar, undemanding quiet that had carried them through every difficult stretch of their lives so far. The announcement that came at the end of that week, delivered by their homeroom teacher with his usual flat, unceremonious efficiency, offered a welcome distraction from the lingering noise of festival attention. Provisional hero licenses. Internship placements with real, licensed agencies, a chance for the whole of Class 1A to step, for the first time, out of the classroom entirely and into something that actually resembled the work they had all been training toward. Izuku spent an entire evening poring over agency profiles with the same meticulous focus he brought to every notebook he had ever filled, weighing rescue specialization against combat experience, agency size against mentorship reputation, until Molly finally took the stack of printouts from his hands with the same weary affection she'd shown over his costume design weeks earlier. "You're going to give yourself a headache," she said. "Just pick the ones that actually interest you. You've got good enough marks from the festival that most of these places would probably take you regardless of how perfectly you optimize the choice." "What about you?" he asked. "Have you picked yet?" "I've got a few in mind," Molly said, a little more carefully than usual, something in her tone that made Izuku glance up from the printouts with sudden, focused attention. "One of them's a rescue and recovery agency that does a lot of medical support work alongside actual combat response. Figured it might be a good fit, given, you know." She gestured vaguely at her own hands. "The whole healing thing. That sounds perfect for you," Izuku said, and meant it entirely, watching something in her shoulders ease at the plain, uncomplicated support in his voice. "Yeah," Molly said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her earlier carefulness. "I think it might be." They spent the following weekend filling out applications together at the apartment's kitchen table, Vaggie hovering nearby with the particular watchful pride she rarely let show as openly as she did that afternoon, occasionally offering a sharp, practical piece of advice about which agencies had genuinely earned their reputations and which had simply bought good publicity, until both stacks of paperwork sat finished and ready, 2 small, careful steps further along a road that had once seemed to a boy bleeding in a Pride Ring gutter, entirely impossible to imagine walking at all. Chapter 19. Their internship placements arrived within the week, each of them assigned to agencies close enough to Muzidifa that Vaggie could still keep a reasonably watchful eye on their comings and goings, and though the two of them had not been placed together, an outcome neither had really expected given how different their chosen agencies were, the arrangement left enough overlap in their schedules that they still managed to meet most evenings, comparing notes over dinner about a working world that felt, to both of them, considerably more demanding and considerably more rewarding than anything the classroom alone had managed to teach them. Izuku's placement put him under the mentorship of a mid-ranking hero known for meticulous, almost obsessive attention to strategy and preparation, a temperament that suited Izuku's own habits so well that his mentor remarked, within the first week, that she had rarely seen an intern take to the analytical side of fieldwork so naturally. He spent long afternoons reviewing case files, learning to read a crisis scene for the details that mattered most before ever setting foot near the actual danger, and though the work rarely involved the kind of dramatic confrontation he had half expected, he found himself surprised by how deeply satisfying it was to feel, for the first time, like a genuinely useful piece of a larger, functioning system rather than simply a student proving himself in isolation. Molly's placement, at the rescue and recovery agency she had chosen with such careful deliberation, put her healing quirk to work in ways that stretched her abilities further than any classroom exercise ever had, treating real injuries sustained by real civilians and real heroes in the aftermath of real incidents. Work that left her physically and emotionally drained by the end of most shifts in a way training had never quite managed to replicate. She came home some evenings quieter than usual, turning over the particular weight of a bad injury she hadn't been able to fully heal, or a frightened civilian she'd had to calm down before she could even begin working, and Izuku, recognizing in her exactly the same instinct she had shown him 100 times over the years, learned quickly to simply sit with her through those quieter evenings rather than pushing her to talk before she was ready. "It's harder than I thought it'd be," she admitted one such evening, curled up on the apartment's narrow balcony with a blanket around her shoulders despite the mild autumn air, staring out at the city lights below. "Not the healing itself. That part one can do in my sleep at this point. It's everything around it. Watching someone be scared and not being able to fix that part no matter how good my quirk gets. You still make it better, though," Izuku said quietly, settling beside her. "Even the parts you can't fix. You told me that yourself, remember? Back when we were kids. You said the part that actually helps is just being there." Molly let out a small, tired laugh, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I hate when you quote me back at myself. Mostly because you're always annoyingly right about it." "Learned from the best," Izuku said, and felt her laugh again, softer this time, some of the day's weariness finally easing out of her shoulders. It was during one such quiet evening, weeks into their respective internships, that Izuku's mentor pulled him aside after a routine case review with an offer that left him staring, momentarily speechless, at a woman who had, until that exact moment, seemed entirely focused on strategy rather than sentiment. A recommendation, she told him, for an advanced training program run in coordination with several of the country's top agencies, an opportunity reserved for interns who had demonstrated, in her words, an unusually sharp instinct for the kind of careful, disciplined thinking that separated a merely capable hero from a genuinely great one. He told Molly about it that same evening, practically vibrating with the same nervous excitement that had once carried him through an acceptance letter he could barely hold steady in his own hands, and Molly, listening to the whole excited rush of it with her usual patient attention, reached over at the end and squeezed his hand once, firm and certain. "Of course they picked you," she said, like it had never once been in doubt. "Took them long enough to notice what I've known since you were 4 years old, bleeding in a gutter and telling me my healing quirk was amazing before anyone else ever bothered to. I couldn't have gotten here without you," Izuku said, and meant it with the whole unguarded honesty of someone who had spent his entire life being carried, healed, and believed in by the same fierce, steady presence at his side. "I know," Molly said, grinning that same shark's grin that had never once changed in all the years he'd known her. "Doesn't mean I'm going to let you stop saying it, though." Chapter 20. The advanced training program, when it finally began in earnest during the last stretch of the term, gathered together a small, select group of students from across the country's various hero courses, a fact that left Izuku equal parts thrilled and quietly, persistently nervous about measuring up against classmates whose reputations, in some cases, preceded them by a considerable margin. Molly, though not selected for the same program, made a point of walking him to the first session anyway, her presence at his side a small, steady anchor against the nerves he'd been carrying all morning. "You're going to be fine," she told him, straightening the collar of his uniform with the same brisk, practical affection Baggy had shown him 100 times over the years. "Better than fine. You've been preparing for exactly this kind of thing since before either of us knew what UA even was. What if everyone else is just naturally better at this than me?" "Then you'll out-prepare them anyway," Molly said, entirely unbothered by the question, "because that's literally the one thing you have always been better at than anyone else I've ever met. Now go. I'll be right here when you're done, and you can tell me everything you learned in far more detail than I probably need." He went, and found, over the following weeks, that her confidence in him had not been misplaced. The program pushed him harder than anything UA's regular coursework had managed, pairing theoretical strategy sessions with grueling physical drills alongside students whose quirks ranged from subtle to genuinely overwhelming, and though there were more than a few sessions that left him exhausted and quietly doubting himself, he found, each time, that the doubt faded a little faster than it once might have, buoyed by years of Molly's steady, unwavering certainty and by a growing, hard-won certainty of his own. Their evenings together grew shorter during that stretch, both of them stretched thin between internship work, program sessions, and the ordinary demands of schoolwork that did not simply pause to accommodate either of their growing ambitions, but they made a quiet, deliberate habit of protecting at least a little time each week, sitting together on the apartment's narrow balcony or walking the long way home from school just to have a few extra minutes of each other's company, a small, stubborn insistence that no amount of growing responsibility would be allowed to crowd out the friendship, and the quietly blossoming something more, that had carried them both this far. It was on one of those balcony evenings, near the very end of the term, with the city lights spread out below them and a comfortable, companionable silence settled between them, that Molly finally said the thing neither of them had quite found the words for in all the years since a rooftop under false stars. "I've been thinking," she said, a little more carefully than her usual blunt directness, "about how we've never actually talked about it. The thing that's kind of just been sitting there for a while now." Izuku's heart gave an uneven, startled thump. "The thing? You know the thing," Molly said, rolling her eyes, though there was a faint flush visible even beneath her gray-blue skin. "The thing where you've kept a little collection of sea glass I like in your desk drawer for years. The thing where I moved my entire class schedule around when we were kids just to sit near you. The thing neither of us has ever actually said out loud because we were both too busy being idiots about it." Izuku, feeling his own face heat considerably, found himself laughing, a little helplessly, at the sheer plain honesty of it, so entirely, characteristically Molly. "I didn't want to make things weird," he admitted. "You're my best friend. You've been my best friend since I was 4 years old. I didn't want to risk that over something I wasn't even sure you felt the same way about." "Izuku." Molly turned to face him fully, her black eyes steady and certain in the way they always were when she had decided something mattered enough to say plainly. "I have healed literally every wound you've ever gotten since we were children. I have rearranged my entire life more than once just to make sure you weren't facing anything alone. I think it's safe to say I feel the same way." The kiss that followed was brief, and gentle, and entirely unremarkable in the way that only the truest, most long-awaited things in life ever manage to be, more a quiet confirmation of something already understood than any grand, dramatic declaration, and when they finally broke apart, both of them a little breathless and considerably more pleased with themselves than either wanted to fully admit, Molly's familiar grin had never looked quite so soft. "Together," she said, the word carrying a weight now it had never quite carried before, though it had always, in truth, meant exactly this. "Together," Izuku echoed, and out beyond the balcony railing, the ordinary human city sprawled on beneath them, indifferent to the small, quiet, enormous thing that had just settled, finally and completely, into place between two children of hell who had spent their whole lives choosing, over and over, to stand exactly where they were standing now. Chapter 21. The final weeks of the term slid by in a warm, contented blur after that evening on the balcony, the two of them settling into the new, quietly acknowledged shape of their relationship with none of the awkwardness Izuku had half feared and all of the easy familiarity that had defined every other year of their long friendship. Dagi, informed of the development with considerably more bashful hesitation from Izuku than the news probably warranted, had simply raised an eyebrow, muttered something about it being about time, and gone back to her tea with the particular unbothered calm of someone who had, in truth, seen it coming since the two of them were small enough to hold hands walking home from a demon schoolhouse. Charlie's reaction, delivered through the small mirror shard, had been considerably more emotional, involving happy tears and a lengthy, only slightly embarrassing speech about how proud she was of the both of them that Izuku suspected he would be hearing echoes of for years to come. Their internships wrapped for the term with a final round of evaluations, both of them receiving notes from their respective mentors that left Vaggie beaming with an openness she rarely allowed herself, and the advanced training program closed out with a final assessment that confirmed, in careful, measured official language, exactly what Molly had been telling Izuku all along, that whatever he lacked in raw quirk power, he more than made up for in the kind of disciplined, adaptable thinking that agencies across the country were, evidently, quite eager to see more of. It was on the last evening before the term's final review, sitting together on their familiar balcony with a quiet neither of them felt any particular need to fill with words, that Izuku found himself turning over, not for the first time, the sheer, improbable distance between the boy he had once been and the person sitting here now, Molly's shoulder warm against his, a whole hero course and a whole complicated, hard-won life stretching out in either direction around them. Do you ever think about it? He asked. How different everything could have gone. If you hadn't come down that alley that day. Molly considered the question with her usual unhurried care, watching the city lights flicker below. Sometimes, she admitted. Mostly I think about how glad I am I did. You'd have found your way eventually, I think. You're too stubborn not to have. But I like to think I made it a little easier. A little less lonely, at least. You made it possible, Izuku said, quiet and certain. Not just easier. Possible. I don't know who I'd be without you, Molly. I don't really want to find out. Every good thing that happened to me this year, the internship, the program, even just surviving that first week of classes, has your fingerprints all over it somewhere, whether you take credit for it or not. Good thing you won't have to, she said, bumping her shoulder against his, the same old familiar gesture that had carried them from a Pride Ring rooftop to a UA training ground to this quiet balcony overlooking a city neither of them had been born into but had both, somewhere along the way, come to think of as home. It had taken years to feel that way, longer for her than she liked to admit out loud, a shopkeeper's daughter learning slowly to trust a sky that never turned red and a sun that never once demanded anything of her in return for its light. But she trusted it now, mostly, and she suspected that trust had grown in exactly the same soil as everything else good in her life recently had, right alongside the boy sitting beside her. I already told you. I don't break promises. Somewhere ahead of them, beyond the quiet close of their first year, lay a second year of hero training that would test them in ways neither could yet fully imagine, deeper internships, harder missions, and villains considerably more dangerous than the ones they had faced so far. Somewhere ahead of them, too, lay the slow, steady work of actually becoming the heroes they had first dreamed of becoming as small children staring into a rippling basement mirror, work that neither of them expected to be easy, and neither of them, standing here together with an entire hard-won year now behind them, had any intention of facing alone. There would be report cards to bring home, agencies to impress, and a whole second year of lessons neither of them had studied yet, but none of that felt half as urgent, sitting here, as simply staying a little longer under a sky that actually held real stars, watching them blink on one by one over a city that had never once, in all their years living in it, tried to tell either of them they didn't belong. For now there was only the warm, settled quiet of the evening, the city sprawled bright and ordinary beneath them, and the steady, certain weight of a promise that had never once, in all the years since a gutter and a handshake, come close to breaking. Chapter 22. Second year at UA arrived with considerably less fanfare than the first, no rippling basement mirror, no nervous first day jitters, just the familiar walk to a familiar classroom, though Izuku noticed, settling into his seat that first morning, that the room felt different in ways that had nothing to do with the furniture. A year of villain attacks and internships and a sports festival broadcast to the entire country had worn away whatever softness the class had carried in as fresh, wide-eyed first years, and what remained in its place was something harder-edged, more deliberate, a room full of students who had all, in their own separate ways, learned exactly how much the work they were training for could cost. You're staring at the wall again, Molly said, sliding into the seat behind him with the same easy familiarity she'd carried since the very first day they'd shared a classroom, human or otherwise. What's the theory this time? No theory, Izuku admitted, glancing back at her. Just thinking about how different everyone looks. Even Bakugo's toned it down a little, somehow, in his own particular way. Bakugo would rather eat his own gauntlets than admit he's toned anything down, Molly said, but yeah. I know what you mean. Feels like everybody grew up a little too fast this year. It was a feeling that only sharpened once their homeroom teacher arrived to lay out the coming term's syllabus, a list considerably heavier than the one that had greeted them as first years, built around a single looming milestone that had every student in the room sitting up a little straighter the moment it was mentioned. The Provisional Hero License Exam, the first true legal gateway toward field work with actual authority behind it, scheduled for early in the term and notorious, according to the whispered accounts of upperclassmen, for a failure rate that left even confident students nervous. Passing this exam, their teacher informed them, with his usual flat, unembellished delivery, means you can legally act under a licensed hero's supervision in real situations. Failing it means waiting another year to try again. I expect every one of you to take that seriously. Izuku, notebook already half filled with a fresh set of observations by the time the syllabus discussion ended, found himself trading a glance with Molly across the aisle, the same silent, wordless understanding that had carried them through every major hurdle so far. They had cleared an entrance exam together. A sports festival. A villain attack neither of them had asked for. Whatever the provisional license exam demanded, they would face it, as they always had, side by side. Their training in the weeks that followed took on a sharper, more focused edge than even their sports festival preparation had managed, both of them well aware that the exam's practical component would test not just raw ability but judgment under genuine, simulated pressure, the kind of layered, unpredictable scenario design that UA's staff had built a considerable reputation around. Izuku spent his evenings reviewing past exam formats with the same meticulous care he brought to everything, cross-referencing rescue protocols against combat tactics, while Molly, true to form, spent hers refining the practical edges of her own power, testing the limits of exactly how much healing she could sustain across a drawn-out scenario without running herself into total exhaustion. "You're going to burn yourself out before the actual exam even starts," Izuku told her one evening, watching her push through a fourth consecutive round of healing drills on a set of practice dummies rigged to simulate escalating injury. "Better to find my limit now, in my own living room, than find out the hard way in the middle of an actual exam scenario," Molly said, though the slight tremor in her hands as she finally sat back suggested she had, in fact, found that limit rather more precisely than she'd intended. "Besides, you're one to talk. You filled an entire notebook this week alone. That's different." "It is not different," Molly said, flopping back against the couch with a groan. "It's exactly the same thing, just with paper instead of practice dummies. We're both ridiculous. Might as well accept it." It was, Izuku reflected, watching her recover with the easy, familiar rhythm of two people who had long since stopped needing to explain their own particular brands of stubbornness to one another, exactly the kind of shared ridiculousness that had carried them this far, and exactly the kind he suspected would carry them through whatever the provisional exam had waiting. Chapter 23. The exam itself convened at a testing facility considerably larger and more elaborate than anything either of them had faced before, a sprawling complex packed with several hundred students from hero courses across the entire country, the written portion administered first in a vast, echoing hall that did little to ease the collective nervous energy humming through the assembled crowd. Izuku moved through the written questions with the same steady, practiced focus that had carried him through every academic test UA had thrown at him so far, years of careful study finally converging into the kind of quiet, confident competence that no longer surprised him quite as much as it once had. The practical portion, when it finally began, split the assembled students into staggered groups assigned to a series of large-scale disaster simulations, each one built around a different combination of hazards designed to test exactly the kind of layered, adaptable judgment their teacher had spent the whole term warning them would matter more than raw power. Izuku and Molly found themselves placed, by simple luck of the group assignments, into the same simulation zone, a sprawling mock urban disaster combining a partially collapsed structure with a rapidly spreading simulated fire, civilian mannequins scattered throughout in configurations designed to force exactly the kind of triage decisions that separated a passing performance from a failing one. "Structural collapse first," Izuku said, already scanning the scene with the fast, practiced eye of someone who had spent years cataloging exactly this kind of scenario, the fire spreading toward it, which means anyone trapped under that section has a shrinking window before both hazards converge. "We pull them first, then work the fire zone." "Agreed," Molly said, already moving, water called up from a ruptured simulated main gushing through the mock street, redirected with careful precision to slow the fire's spread just enough to buy the extra minutes his plan required. "You clear the rubble, I'll keep the fire contained. Shout if you find someone actually pinned, my healing's not going to help much if a support beam's sitting on somebody's chest." They worked through the scenario with the same wordless, practiced coordination that had carried them through every crisis so far, real or simulated, Izuku's careful reading of the collapsing structure guiding them toward trapped mannequins in exactly the sequence that minimized further risk, Molly's water holding the encroaching fire at bay long enough for each extraction to finish clean. It was not a flawless run. A miscalculated support beam nearly came down on Izuku's shoulder in the scenario's final stretch, avoided only by a half-second dive that left him coated in simulated dust and considerably more rattled than he let show, and by the time the proctors called an end to the exercise, both of them were breathing hard, exhausted in the particular satisfied way that came from having genuinely earned the outcome rather than simply surviving it. Clean extraction on all 6 simulated civilians, the proctor informed them afterward, reviewing a tablet with the same flat efficiency that seemed to run through every official at the facility. Efficient hazard management. Good coordination between partners. A pause, the proctor glancing up at them with something that might, on a more expressive face, have qualified as approval. You two have clearly trained together before. Since we were 4, Molly said, with the particular satisfied bluntness that Izuku had loved about her since long before either of them had words for love at all. Chapter 24. The results, posted a week later in the same flat, official format UA favored for every major announcement, confirmed what both of them had quietly hoped but not quite allowed themselves to fully expect. Passing marks, comfortably above the exam's notoriously demanding threshold, provisional licenses secured for both of them well ahead of several of their classmates whose own results trickled in with considerably more anxious hand-wringing attached. Bakugo passed too, of course, with marks that left even their usually unflappable homeroom teacher offering something close to a genuine compliment, and though Izuku still felt the old familiar prickle of competitive comparison whenever Bakugo's name came up on any ranked list, it landed, these days, more like fuel than injury. A reminder of exactly how far he still intended to push himself rather than a measure of how far short he currently fell. Dagi's reaction to the news, delivered over dinner the evening the results posted, involved considerably more visible emotion than she usually allowed herself, a fierce, wordless hug for both of them that lasted a good deal longer than her usual brisk affection typically permitted, and Charlie, reached through the mirror shard shortly after, dissolved almost immediately into the kind of happy, overwhelmed tears that had become something of a running, gentle joke between the two children over the years, though neither of them ever teased her about it quite as much as they pretended they might. "My son," Charlie said, voice thick, staring at both their faces through the small rippling mirror with an expression that managed to be simultaneously proud and faintly disbelieving, "and my future daughter-in-law, both licensed provisional heroes. I don't think I have properly processed how fast you've both grown up." "Mom," Izuku said, flushing considerably at the phrase future daughter-in-law, though beside him Molly's grin only widened at the sight of his embarrassment, entirely unbothered by the implication herself. "What?" Charlie said, entirely unrepentant. "It's true, isn't it?" Neither of them had a ready answer for that, mostly because neither of them particularly wanted to argue the point, and the conversation dissolved shortly afterward into a comfortable, familiar back and forth about their respective plans for the coming term, Charlie peppering them with questions about internship placements and training schedules with the same eager, involved interest she had shown since the very first mirror they'd ever looked through together. It was a rare, uncomplicated kind of happiness, the sort that Izuku had learned, over the years, not to take entirely for granted, and it lingered pleasantly through the following weeks, both of them settling into their newly licensed status with a fresh sense of purpose that neither the written exam's difficulty nor the practical's genuine danger had managed to dampen. Their agencies, informed of the successful licensing, offered expanded responsibilities almost immediately, Izuku finding himself trusted with a wider range of field observation duties, Molly assigned to shadow more advanced medical response scenarios that pushed her healing quirk into territory even her earlier internship work had not fully explored. It was during one such expanded shift, weeks into the new arrangement, that their respective agencies received, within the same afternoon, an identical piece of correspondence that would, within the month, change the shape of their entire summer. Chapter 25. The announcement, delivered to the whole of Class 1A on a bright, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, took the form of a training camp, a joint venture between UA and the Pussycats, a well-established rescue and support agency known for its rigorous, remote training facilities, designed to push the class's abilities further than a semester of ordinary coursework could manage on its own. A full week, tucked away in a mountain lodge far removed from the city's usual comforts, focused entirely on quirk refinement and physical conditioning under the direct supervision of licensed professional heroes. Sounds intense, Molly said, reading over the announcement packet with the same careful, practical attention she brought to every new challenge, but good intense. I could use a full week focused purely on pushing my healing range without worrying about internship schedules or exams hanging over it. I've read about the Pussycats' training methods, Izuku said, already flipping through his own copy of the packet with visible excitement, notebook practically twitching in his bag. Their facilities built around this whole mountain terrain system, natural obstacles instead of artificial ones, supposed to be some of the best conditioning work in the country. Of course you already know all this, Molly said, fond exasperation warm in her voice. I don't even know why I bother being surprised anymore. The weeks leading up to the trip passed in a familiar rhythm of anticipation and preparation, both of them packing and repacking their gear with a thoroughness that had Vaggie, watching the process unfold across their apartment's living room floor, offering dry commentary about whether either of them intended to actually leave room in their bags for clothing amid all the training equipment they seemed determined to bring along. You'll be fine, she told them both, the morning of departure, tucking a small emergency kit into Izuku's bag with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every practical concern in their lives. Licensed professionals running the camp, proper safety protocols, and the two of you have gotten yourselves through considerably worse than a week of mountain training. Just. She paused, something flickering briefly across her expression that Izuku recognized, even now, as the same old protective worry she had carried since the very first night they'd claimed him as family. Look out for each other. The way you always do. Always, Izuku promised, and beside him Molly nodded, the same wordless certainty that had carried them through every promise made and kept since a gutter and a handshake too strong for small hands. The bus ride out to the mountain facility carried the whole of Class 1A in a buzz of restless energy, speculation running rampant about exactly what the week's training would entail, and Izuku spent much of the journey with his face nearly pressed to the window again, the same excited posture that had carried him toward the USJ facility a lifetime ago, watching the city give way to winding mountain roads and thick, unbroken forest that felt, in its own quiet way, worlds apart from the sprawling urban landscape they'd grown so accustomed to training in. He had no way of knowing, watching the trees blur past the window with Molly's shoulder warm against his in the seat beside him, that this particular week, of all the ordinary, demanding weeks that had filled their 2 years at UA so far, was about to become the hardest test either of them had faced since the very day a dark, unnatural portal had first torn open in the middle of a training facility they'd once believed was safe. Chapter 26. The mountain facility, when the bus finally wound its way up the last stretch of narrow road toward it, turned out to be even more remote and more striking than the training packet's photographs had suggested, a cluster of low, sturdy buildings nestled against a backdrop of dense forest and rising peaks, the air noticeably thinner and cleaner than anything either of them had grown used to breathing back in Muzitafu. The Pussycats greeted the class with a warm, energetic enthusiasm that stood in stark, welcome contrast to their usual instructor's flat delivery, and within the first hour of arrival the whole of Class 1A found themselves divided into small groups and set loose across a training course built directly into the mountain's natural terrain. Izuku's group spent the first full day scaling a series of increasingly steep rock faces under close supervision, a physical challenge that tested his conditioning in ways even his most demanding solo training sessions back home had never quite managed to replicate, and he came away from the exercise with his arms trembling and a fresh, hard-won appreciation for exactly how much further his body could still be pushed. Molly's group, assigned to a different section of the course focused on quirk endurance under sustained physical strain, returned from their own first day looking equally exhausted, though considerably more satisfied with the progress she reported having made in extending the range of her healing without the usual toll it took on her afterward. I healed 6 separate simulated injuries back-to-back today without needing a real recovery break in between, she told him over dinner that evening, practically glowing with the particular pride of someone who had genuinely surprised herself. 6. Izuku. Back home I'd have been flat on my back after the 4th one. That's incredible, Izuku said, and meant it entirely, watching the exhausted satisfaction on her face with the same warm, uncomplicated pride he always felt watching her prove, over and over, exactly how far her supposedly boring, unflashy quirk could actually carry her, further with every year than anyone back in the Pride Ring had ever once believed possible. The days that followed settled into a demanding, satisfying rhythm, mornings spent on physical conditioning across the mountain's natural obstacles, afternoons devoted to more targeted quirk refinement work under the pussycat's close, encouraging supervision, evenings spent comparing notes with exhausted classmates over communal dinners that had, by the third night, taken on the easy, companionable feel of a shared experience rather than simply a training exercise. Even Bakugo, worn down by the sheer physical demand of the mountain course, had grown marginally less abrasive by the middle of the week, a fact that more than one classmate remarked on with visible, careful amusement. It was on the fourth evening, the whole of Class 1A gathered for a final debrief before the following day's more advanced training exercises, that their lead instructor laid out the plan for what remained of the week, a series of increasingly demanding scenarios building toward a final, capstone test of everything they had refined over the preceding days. Tomorrow, the instructor informed them, with the same warm but serious energy that had defined the whole week's teaching style, we test everything you've learned in a controlled, monitored environment. Full mountain terrain, real-time coordination, exactly the kind of scenario a genuine rescue mission might actually demand of you. I want you all rested and ready. Izuku went to bed that night with the same restless, excited anticipation that had carried him through every major test UA had thrown at him so far, notebook filled with fresh observations from the week's training, Molly's steady presence in the cabin bunk beside his own a familiar, grounding comfort against the particular nervous energy that always preceded a real test of his abilities. Neither of them had any way of knowing, drifting off to sleep with the mountain's quiet, unfamiliar sound settling around them, that the actual test waiting for them the following day would have nothing at all to do with the carefully planned scenario their instructors had spent the week building toward. Chapter 27. The attack came without warning, in the early hours of the following evening, while the class was scattered across the mountain's training zones in small groups working through the week's planned capstone exercise. Izuku, deep in a heavily wooded section of the course with two classmates and a pussycat instructor overseeing their progress, felt the first sign of trouble before he properly understood what it meant, a sudden, unnatural stillness settling over the forest that had nothing to do with the exercise's careful choreography. Then the trees ahead of them split apart, not from any natural force but from something enormous and monstrous crashing through the undergrowth with a speed and power that sent their supervising instructor immediately into a defensive stance, shouting orders for the students to fall back even as the creature, some kind of hulking, unnatural mass of muscle and exposed brain matter that Izuku recognized with a cold jolt of horror from grainy footage of the USJ attack months earlier, closed the distance with terrifying speed. Move, the instructor barked, already moving to intercept, get back to the lodge, now, this isn't part of the exercise. The scramble that followed dissolved into exactly the kind of chaos Izuku had trained for and never actually wanted to face again. The forest around them erupting with the sounds of distant conflict as similar creatures, and villains alongside them, tore into the mountain facility from multiple directions at once, clearly a coordinated assault rather than any isolated incident. Izuku's group scattered under the sheer overwhelming pressure of the creature bearing down on them, and in the confusion, in the desperate scramble to put distance between themselves and a monster that outmatched every one of them individually, he found himself separated from his classmates entirely, alone in unfamiliar terrain with the sound of chaos echoing from every direction at once. His first thought, sharp and immediate even through the fear flooding his chest, was Molly, somewhere on the far side of the mountain facility in a training zone he had no clear way to reach, and the particular, specific terror of not knowing whether she was safe hit him harder than the physical danger of his own situation ever could have. He forced himself to think, the same disciplined, careful reasoning that had carried him through every crisis so far cutting through the panic threatening to overwhelm him entirely. The lodge sat roughly northeast of his current position, based on the angle of the setting sun through the canopy above. If he could work his way back toward it, avoiding the worst of the chaos, he might find other scattered students, might find a way to actually help rather than simply surviving alone in the dark. He moved fast and low through the underbrush, every sense straining for signs of danger, and it was perhaps 20 minutes into that careful, harrowing trek that he heard it, a familiar voice raised in a furious shout somewhere ahead through the trees, and felt something in his chest unclench for the first time since the attack began. Molly, he breathed, and broke into a dead sprint toward the sound. He found her in a small clearing, water surging around her in defensive arcs, holding off two separate attackers with a fierce, focused intensity that left no room in her expression for the fear he knew she had to be feeling somewhere beneath it, and the sight of her, alive and fighting and utterly, characteristically unwilling to back down, hit him with a wave of relief so overwhelming it very nearly buckled his knees. Izuku. Her voice cracked with something between relief and fresh alarm the moment she spotted him, water faltering for just a half-second before she forced her focus back to the fight in front of her. Stay back, there's two of them. He didn't stay back. He threw himself into the fight instead, exactly as he always had, exactly as the promise made on a rooftop under false stars had always demanded of him, and together, the same wordless, practiced coordination that had carried them through every crisis so far, taking over where individual fear might otherwise have won out, they turned the tide of the fight in the clearing, buying themselves, at last, a narrow, precious window to move. We need to get back to the lodge, Izuku said, breathless, checking her over for injuries with the same fast, careful assessment she always used on him. Are you hurt? Nothing you're worrying is going to fix faster than just moving, Molly said, already healing a shallow cut along her own forearm even as she spoke, grabbing his hand and pulling him into motion. Come on. Whatever's happening, it's bigger than just us. Other people need help too. Chapter 28. They moved through the chaos together, the mountain facility around them a scene of scattered fighting and frightened, disoriented students, and though every instinct screamed at Izuku to simply get Molly somewhere safe and stay there, he understood, watching her push forward with the same fierce, unshakable resolve she'd carried since she was 4 years old, standing between him and a pack of imp children, that safety had never once been the point for either of them. The point had always been standing where they were needed, together, whatever the cost. They found a cluster of first-year students pinned down near the lodge's outer perimeter, cut off by two more of the hulking, monstrous creatures that had torn through the mountain earlier, and Izuku's mind, even through the fear still hammering in his chest, fell automatically into the same careful, analytical pattern that had carried him through every crisis before this one. He read the terrain, the creatures' movement patterns, the narrow gap in their coordinated advance that might, with the right timing, let the trapped students slip free. Molly, on my signal, water wall along the eastern edge, just enough to blind them for a few seconds. I'll draw their attention toward the treeline. That's a terrible plan, Molly said, already moving into position, water gathering at her fingertips despite the visible exhaustion the day's earlier fight had already carved into her posture. I hate it. Do it anyway. He did it anyway, breaking cover with a shout that pulled both creatures' attention squarely onto himself, leading them on a desperate, weaving sprint through the treeline while behind him Molly's water surged up in a blinding wall that gave the trapped students exactly the window they needed to scramble free toward the lodge's relative safety. It was, by a considerable margin, the most reckless thing Izuku had ever done, and it worked exactly long enough to matter, the creature's confused, disoriented pursuit giving the students precious seconds before one of the monsters finally caught up to him with a glancing blow that sent him tumbling hard across the forest floor, pain exploding through his side with enough force to steal the breath entirely from his lungs. Izuku. Molly's voice tore across the clearing, raw with a fear he had rarely heard in it, and then she was there, water lashing out in a furious, protective barrier between him and the advancing creature, her hands already glowing warm and urgent against the worst of the damage along his ribs even as she kept her eyes locked, hard and unyielding, on the threat still bearing down on them both. I'm okay, he managed, though the words came out considerably more strained than he intended. Molly, I'm okay, focus on the... I know what I'm focusing on, she snapped, and the fierce, protective edge in her voice left no room for argument, water surging out in a final, decisive wave that finally drove the creature back long enough for the sound of approaching pro-heroes, drawn by the commotion, to reach them both through the chaos. It was Mount Lady, arriving at a full sprint with two other licensed heroes close behind, who finally cleared the immediate threat entirely, and in the sudden, ringing quiet that followed, Izuku found himself sitting slumped against a fallen log with Molly pressed close against his side, both of them trembling with the particular bone-deep exhaustion of adrenaline finally beginning to fade, her hands still glowing faintly as she finished mending the worst of the damage to his ribs. You absolute idiot, she said, voice thick, healing hands never once pausing despite the tremor in them. You could have died. Drawing two of those things away from a group of first years with nothing but your own two legs, are you completely out of your mind? They needed help, Izuku said quietly, and found, even through the pain and the exhaustion, that he meant it with the same simple, uncomplicated certainty that had carried him through every reckless, necessary risk since long before either of them had earned a license to take one. Molly didn't argue the point further. She simply pulled him closer instead, forehead pressed against his shoulder, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply breathing together in the aftermath of a night that had asked more of both of them than any single training exercise ever should have. Chapter 29. The full scope of the attack only became clear in the hours that followed, as scattered groups of students and instructors slowly regrouped at the lodge under the protection of the pro-heroes who had arrived to clear the mountain of the last remaining threats. A coordinated assault, the whole of Class 1A learned in a grim, exhausted debrief that stretched well past midnight, orchestrated by a loose coalition of villains who had apparently spent months planning an attempt to abduct students directly from the supposedly secure training camp, a plan that had, in the end, been thwarted by the combined efforts of the assembled instructors, the students' own hard-won training, and, in more than one case, the sheer stubborn refusal of individual students to simply run when others still needed help. No one had been abducted. That single fact, repeated with visible relief by every instructor who addressed the shaken, exhausted class that night, did little to fully settle the raw, unsteady nerves of a group of teenagers who had just faced down real, deliberate danger for the second time in their 2 years at UA. Several students carried minor injuries. A few carried the kind of deeper, less visible shakiness that came from having genuinely believed, even briefly, that the night might end considerably worse than it had. Izuku, ribs still faintly sore despite Molly's earlier healing, spent the remainder of that night sitting close beside her in the lodge's crowded main hall, neither of them saying very much, simply present in the particular, wordless way that had carried them through every difficult aftermath before this one. When Vaggie arrived at the facility before dawn, summoned by an emergency notification the moment news of the attack reached UA, she found both of them exactly where she expected to, curled together on a narrow bench, and the fierce, wordless hug she pulled them both into lasted considerably longer than even her earlier reaction to their licensing results had. I am going to have several very pointed conversations with the people responsible for this facility's security, Vaggie said, once she had finally, reluctantly let them go, her voice carrying the particular controlled fury of someone determined not to fall apart in front of the two people she had spent years determined to protect. But right now I just need to know you're both actually alright. Really alright, not the alright you tell me so I stop worrying. We're alright, Molly said, quiet but certain, and beside her Izuku nodded, and though the words carried the particular weariness of two people who had just survived something genuinely terrifying, there was no lie in them either, both of them steady, present, and, however shaken, still standing. Charlie's reaction, delivered through an emergency mirror connection the moment Vaggie could arrange one, involved considerably more raw fear than her earlier happy tears over their licensing results, and it took the better part of an hour, both children patiently walking her through every detail of the night, before her own panic finally settled into something closer to the exhausted, grateful relief that came from knowing her family had survived something that could very easily have ended in tragedy. I know I can't keep you both wrapped in cotton forever, Charlie admitted eventually, her voice still faintly unsteady through the rippling mirror. I know this is the path you both chose, and I am so proud of you for choosing it, even on nights like this one. But please. Just let me be scared out loud sometimes. Let me be your mother, not just your biggest fan, on the nights it actually matters. Always, Izuku promised, and meant it with the whole of a heart that understood, more clearly than ever after a night like this one, exactly how much that fear came from love rather than doubt. Chapter 30. The remainder of the camp was cancelled outright, the whole of Class 1A returned to UA under heightened security within 2 days of the attack, and though the school's official statements to worried parents and an anxious press emphasized, repeatedly, that the situation had been fully contained, the lingering unease of that night settled over the class in a way that no official reassurance could quite fully dissolve. Counseling sessions were made available. Several students took them up on the offer, and Izuku, encouraged gently but firmly by both Vaggie and Molly, attended a handful himself, working through the particular tangled knot of fear and reckless resolve that the attack had left coiled in his chest. Molly, true to the pattern of a lifetime spent processing her own difficult feelings through blunt, practical honesty rather than quiet withdrawal, spoke openly in her own sessions about the fear that had gripped her the moment she realized Izuku had drawn two monstrous villains away from a group of trapped first years with nothing but his own body between them and disaster. And though the counselor's gentle questions occasionally left her more raw than she expected, she came away from each session a little steadier than she'd gone in, the particular relief of having finally said certain fears out loud settling something in her that even her own healing quirk had never quite managed to reach. "I keep thinking about what you said," she told Izuku one evening, weeks after the attack, the two of them sitting together on their familiar apartment balcony with the ordinary, comforting hum of the city spread out below them. About how they needed help, like that just automatically outweighed everything else. "I get it, Izuku. I really do. It's the same thing that's kept me standing between you and every threat since we were kids. But it terrifies me too. Watching you throw yourself into danger like your own safety doesn't factor into the equation at all." "It does factor in," Izuku said quietly, turning to face her fully. "It's just not the only thing in the equation. I think about you every single time. About what it would do to you, to Mom, to Vaggie, if something actually happened to me. That fear doesn't stop me from helping. It just makes me more careful about how I do it." Molly considered this for a long moment, her black eyes steady on his in the dim evening light. "I don't think I could ever ask you to stop being exactly who you are," she admitted finally. "It's the same reason I fell for you in the first place, if I'm honest. You care so much it scares me sometimes. But I need you to promise me something. Anything." "Careful doesn't mean alone," Molly said, firm and certain. "Whatever reckless plan your brain cooks up next time something like this happens, you loop me in. You don't go running off drawing monsters into the tree line without me right there beside you, healing hands ready. Deal?" "Deal," Izuku said, and meant it completely, the same old promise reshaped once again into a slightly different, slightly more hard-won shape, exactly the way it always seemed to grow between them, year after year, crisis after crisis, without ever once losing the fundamental core of what it had always meant. Chapter 31. The remainder of the term settled, gradually, back into something resembling its earlier rhythm, though neither Izuku nor Molly, nor indeed the rest of their shaken but resilient class, ever quite let go of the sharper, more serious edge the mountain attack had carved into all of them. Training intensified in its wake, not out of fear exactly, but out of the same hard-won, clear-eyed understanding that had settled over the whole of Class 1A since that night, that the work they were training for carried real, genuine cost, and that being ready for it mattered more than ever. Izuku's mentor, informed of the full details of the attack through official channels, took a personal interest afterward in refining exactly the kind of tactical, high-pressure decision-making that had let him coordinate a rescue in the middle of genuine chaos, and the sessions that followed pushed him further, in some ways, than even the advanced training program earlier in the year had managed. Molly's own agency placement expanded to include crisis response training specifically, a natural extension of a healing quirk that had, in the space of one terrifying night, proven itself capable of holding together far more than simple training injuries ever demanded of it. They grew closer through it all, if such a thing were even possible after a lifetime already built around each other, the particular shared weight of having faced something genuinely dangerous together settling into a deeper, steadier kind of trust than even their years of friendship and their newer, still occasionally shy romance had fully established before. Vaggie, watching the two of them navigate the aftermath with a maturity that struck her, more than once, as almost unfair to ask of teenagers still working through their own second year of hero school, found herself, in quiet moments, marveling at exactly how far both children had come since a night years earlier when she had first agreed, reluctantly, to let them cross a basement mirror into a world neither of them fully understood yet. It was on a quiet evening near the term's end, the two of them walking the long way home from their respective internships out of habit more than necessity, that Molly finally broached the subject that had been quietly building in the back of both their minds since the attack, an idea that had taken root somewhere in the exhausted, clarifying aftermath of that terrifying night and refused, in all the weeks since, to fully let go. "I've been thinking about where we go from here," she said, careful in the particular way she reserved for things that mattered enough to get exactly right. Not just the rest of the term. After. When we actually graduate, get our full licenses, start doing this for real instead of just training toward it. What are you thinking? Izuku asked, though something in her tone already suggested he wouldn't be surprised by the answer. I want us to work together, Molly said, plain and direct in the way she always was about the things that mattered most. Not just as partners in the vague, someday sense. I mean an actual team. Your strategy, my healing, both of us in the field together instead of scattered across separate agencies hoping our schedules line up. I think we're better that way. I think we've always been better that way. Izuku felt something warm and certain settle in his chest, the same old promise, reshaped once again into its next, natural evolution, and found, turning the idea over, that he could not imagine wanting it any other way. Together, he said, the word carrying, as it always did between them, the whole weight of everything they had built since a gutter and a handshake too strong for small hands. Together, Molly agreed, and above them, the city lights flickered on one by one against the gathering dusk, a whole future still stretching out ahead of two children of hell who had, against every early doubt either of them had ever carried, found not just survival in the bright unfamiliar world above, but a purpose, a partnership, and a love that had grown, slowly and surely, out of the truest, most stubborn promise either of them had ever made. Chapter 32. Summer break arrived not long after that quiet evening's conversation, and though the whole of Class 1A scattered briefly to visit families and catch up on the rest that a demanding year had left most of them badly needing, Izuku and Molly spent the bulk of it exactly where they always had, together, splitting their days between agency work, continued training, and the particular, treasured stretches of ordinary time that a year as eventful as this one had left in short supply. Daggy took them both, for the first time in longer than any of them could quite remember, on an actual, unhurried vacation, a week spent at a quiet coastal town far from the city's noise, and Izuku watched, with a warmth that settled deep and permanent in his chest, as Molly waded into the ocean on the very first afternoon with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy that had nothing at all to do with training or duty or the weight of everything they'd survived together. I forgot how much I actually love the ocean, she admitted, standing waist-deep in the surf with her eyes closed, water swirling gently around her in lazy, contented eddies that responded to her presence the way a familiar room might respond to someone finally coming home. Back in the ring, all I ever had was that little collection of shells at Mom's shop. This is different. This is mine. It suits you, Izuku said, wading out to join her, and found himself laughing, entirely without warning, when a sudden playful wave, clearly not a natural one at all, sent him stumbling backward into the surf with an undignified splash. Everything suits me, Molly said, grinning that same fierce, familiar grin, entirely unrepentant about the ambush. Get used to it. They spent that week swimming and walking the shoreline and simply existing together in a way that felt, after the intensity of the preceding months, almost indulgently peaceful, and Vaggie, watching them from a beachside cafe with a cup of tea she rarely allowed herself the leisure to properly enjoy, found herself thinking, more than once, about exactly how far both children had come from the small, hurting boy and the fierce, protective girl she had first watched form an unlikely friendship. In a Pride Ring alleyway all those years ago, Charlie visited for 2 full days near the trip's end, slipping through a temporary mirror crossing arranged well in advance, and the sight of his mother laughing freely on an ordinary human beach, sand between her toes for what she admitted was the very first time in her long, complicated existence, left Izuku with a particular, quiet kind of happiness that he suspected he would carry with him for the rest of his life. By the time the new term loomed on the horizon, both of them returned to Muzidifa rested, steady, and, in the particular way that only genuine peace could manage, more ready than ever for whatever the coming year of hero training still had in store. Chapter 33. The new term opened with a fresh round of practical exams, a shifting of internship placements, and, for the first time since their earliest days at UA, a genuine, official acknowledgement from the school administration of exactly how much both Izuku and Molly had grown into the kind of students their instructors now spoke of, in careful, measured official language, as genuinely exceptional prospects for the profession ahead of them. Izuku's tactical thinking, refined through 2 years of relentless study and, more recently, The hard-won lessons of a night that had asked more of him than any classroom exercise ever could, drew the attention of agencies well beyond the modest placement he had started with, and Molly's healing quirk, once dismissed by an entire kingdom of demons as a lesser, boring power, had become, in the hands of a girl who had spent her whole life refusing to accept that verdict, one of the most sought after specialties among the rescue and recovery agencies actively recruiting from UA's upper years. Bakugo, in his own gruff, characteristically indirect way, acknowledged as much one afternoon in the training grounds, catching Izuku alone during a rare quiet moment between exercises. "You've gotten better," he said, without any of his usual venom, arms crossed, gaze fixed somewhere just past Izuku's shoulder rather than meeting his eyes directly. "Don't let it go to your head, Deku. Still got a long way to go before you're actually worth taking seriously." "Coming from you, that's basically a compliment," Izuku said, and Bakugo's scowl deepened at being called out on it, though he did not, notably, argue the point. It was a small moment, easily overlooked, but Izuku found himself turning it over that evening regardless, telling Molly about it over dinner with a faint, bemused smile that she matched easily enough once he finished the story. "He's never going to just say something nice outright," Molly said, not unkindly. "Some people just aren't built that way. Doesn't mean it doesn't count when it happens." "I used to hate him," Izuku admitted, turning his chopsticks over idly. "Really hate him?" "I don't think I do anymore. I think I understand him a little better now. All that anger, it's just fear wearing a much louder costume." "Look at you," Molly said, grinning, getting all wise and reflective. "Careful, or I'm going to start expecting actual emotional insight out of you on a regular basis." "You've always expected too much of me," Izuku said, laughing, and found, watching her laugh in return, the particular easy warmth that came from having built an entire life, brick by careful brick, out of exactly this kind of ordinary, precious closeness. As the term deepened, their combined focus turned increasingly toward the horizon still waiting beyond UA's walls entirely, toward graduation, toward full licenses, toward the shared future Molly had first put into plain, deliberate words on a quiet evening walk home from their internships. They began, in small, careful ways, laying the groundwork for exactly the kind of partnership she had described, researching agency structures that supported paired hero teams, discussing, late into more than one evening, exactly what kind of work they both wanted their eventual careers to center around. "Disaster response," Molly said firmly, more than once, whenever the conversation turned toward specifics. "Somewhere our skills actually complement each other best. Your strategy gets people out of danger. My healing keeps them alive once they're out. That's not a small thing, Izuku. That's the whole point of everything we've been training for." Together, Izuku agreed, and found, each time the word came up between them, that it had lost none of the weight it carried since a rooftop under false stars, still exactly as certain, exactly as unshakable, as it had always been. Whatever the rest of their time at UA still had waiting, whatever trials and dangers and hard-won victories still lay ahead on the long road toward becoming the heroes they had first dreamed of as small children staring into a rippling basement mirror, they faced it now with a steadiness neither of them had possessed at the very start, forged through years of shared struggle, shared triumph, and a promise that had only grown stronger, term after term, for every test it had ever been asked to survive. Chapter 34. Autumn settled over Muzutafu with its usual quiet transition, the city's trees turning slowly toward gold along the routes Izuku and Molly had long since memorized on their walks to and from school. And with the change of season came a fresh wave of responsibility neither of them had quite anticipated when the term first began. Their homeroom teacher, gathering the class for an announcement that had every student sitting up with the particular sharp attention that had become second nature since the mountain attack, informed them that this year's curriculum would include, for the first time, supervised participation in genuine, low-risk field operations alongside licensed agencies, real work carried out under real, if carefully managed, stakes. "This is not a simulation," their teacher reminded them, with his usual flat emphasis on exactly the words that mattered most. "You will be assisting licensed professionals with actual cases. Missing person searches. Minor disaster cleanup. Community safety patrols. It is not glamorous work, and I expect every one of you to treat it with the seriousness it deserves regardless. Izuku's first assignment paired him with his mentor on a search operation following a minor landslide on the city's outskirts, work that demanded exactly the kind of careful, methodical thinking he had spent years cultivating, and though the case resolved without any dramatic confrontation at all, simply the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of locating two elderly residents safely sheltering in a partially collapsed outbuilding, he came away from it with a fresh, grounded understanding of exactly what the profession he had spent his whole life dreaming toward actually looked like in its most ordinary, essential form, a far cry from the grainy heroic footage that had first captured his imagination as a small boy but no less meaningful for the difference. It wasn't dramatic, he told Molly that evening, turning the day over in his mind with the same thoughtful care he applied to everything. No villains, no big rescue moment for the cameras. Just two scared people who needed someone to find them and tell them it was going to be okay. That's most of the job, probably, Molly said, settling in beside him with her own quiet satisfaction from a similarly unglamorous shift assisting with post-storm medical support at a community shelter. The flashy stuff makes the news. This is what actually holds a city together, day to day. I think I like it. I think I like it a lot, honestly. Me too, Izuku admitted, and found, saying it aloud, that the realization settled something in him that had been quietly shifting for months now, a growing understanding that the heroism he had first dreamed of as a small boy pressing his hands against a rippling mirror had always been less about grand, dramatic gestures, and more about exactly this, the patient, unglamorous work of simply showing up for people who needed help, over and over, without ever once requiring an audience to make it matter. Their supervised fieldwork continued through the following weeks, each assignment offering its own small, quiet lessons that no classroom exercise could have fully replicated, and though neither of them encountered anything approaching the genuine danger of the mountain attack during that stretch, the steady accumulation of real, hands-on experience left both of them more confident, more capable, and more certain than ever of exactly the shape their future partnership was meant to take. Chapter 35. It was during one such assignment, a joint search and rescue operation following a warehouse fire on the city's industrial edge, that Izuku and Molly found themselves working alongside each other in an official capacity for the very first time, both of them assigned, by fortunate coincidence of scheduling, to the same supervising heroes team for the day. The fire itself had already been contained by the time they arrived, the immediate danger past, but the search for any workers who might still be trapped inside the damaged structure remained urgent, delicate work that demanded exactly the kind of coordination they had spent a lifetime perfecting. Feels different, doing this for real instead of a training scenario, Molly murmured, water already gathering faintly at her fingertips as they moved carefully through the warehouse's smoke-damaged interior, following Izuku's careful reading of the structural weak points that might indicate where a trapped worker had taken shelter. Good different or bad different? Izuku asked, ducking beneath a sagging support beam with practiced care. Good, Molly said, after a moment's consideration. Scarier, but good. Like it actually counts now, instead of just practicing for the day it might. They found the trapped worker exactly where Izuku's careful reading of the structure had suggested he might be, sheltered in a reinforced supply closet that had held against the worst of the collapse, and Molly's hands were already glowing warm before Izuku had even finished clearing the debris blocking the door, treating a nasty gash along the man's arm with the same steady, practiced efficiency she had spent years refining. The whole rescue took less than 10 minutes from start to finish, unremarkable by the standards of anything either of them had faced during the mountain attack, and yet Izuku found himself, walking the shaken but grateful worker back out into the daylight, struck by a quiet, settled certainty that had nothing at all to do with the relative ease of the task. This was it. This was exactly what he had wanted since he was a small boy watching grainy footage of a smiling giant pulling a family from a collapsed stairwell, since a mother's mirror had first shown him a world where quirks could be used to protect instead of simply to win. Not the fame, not the rankings, not even the particular thrill of a hard-fought sports festival match. Just this. A frightened person, safely returned to the daylight, because he and Molly, working exactly as they always had refused to let anything less be good enough. Their supervising hero, reviewing the operation afterward with the same brisk professionalism most licensed heroes brought to routine debriefs, offered them both a rare, genuine compliment on the efficiency of their coordination, and though the words themselves were simple enough, Izuku found them settling into his chest with a weight that no sports festival ranking had ever quite managed to match. You two work like you've been partners for years, the hero remarked, glancing between them with mild, professional curiosity. Something like that, Molly said, catching Izuku's eye with a small, private smile that carried the whole of their shared history behind it, every year since a gutter and a handshake compressed into one simple, knowing look. That evening, walking home together through streets gone gold and orange with the last of the autumn light, neither of them said very much at all, content simply to walk side by side in the particular, comfortable quiet that had defined so much of their long life together. It was Molly who finally broke the silence, near the last stretch before their apartment, her voice quiet but certain in the fading light. "We're actually going to do this," she said. "For real. Not someday. Soon. Graduate, get our full licenses, build exactly the kind of team we've been talking about." Soon, Izuku agreed, and felt, saying it, the whole weight of every year that had carried them to this exact moment, every wound healed, every promise kept, every small, stubborn choice that two children of hell had made, over and over, to stand together rather than apart. "I can't wait." "Me neither," Molly said, and slipped her hand into his. The same small hand that had once gripped his with a strength too strong for a 4-year-old on a gutter street behind an old cathedral district, now grown steady and sure and utterly, permanently entwined with his own. Together, as they always had been, and together, as they both fully intended to remain, for whatever the long, hard, beautiful road ahead still had in store. Chapter 36. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the mountains beyond Muzitafu with the first snow of the season while the city itself settled into the brisk, bundled rhythm of its coldest months, and with it came the final stretch of their second year at UA, exams and evaluations and the quiet, mounting anticipation of a third year that both of them knew would push them harder than anything they had yet faced. The streets around their apartment took on a particular hush in those final weeks, shop fronts strung with warm lights, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a vendor's cart near the train station they passed each morning on their way to school, and more than once Izuku found himself simply pausing on the walk home to take in the quiet, ordinary beauty of a season neither of them had ever properly experienced back in the Pride Ring, where the weather never shifted and the calendar rarely meant much of anything at all. Izuku spent the closing weeks of the term compiling, at his mentor's suggestion, a full portfolio of his tactical work across the year, from the provisional exam through the warehouse rescue, a careful, methodical record of exactly how far he had come from the boy who had once believed a lack of quirk meant a lack of worth entirely. Molly's own closing weeks carried a similar weight of reflection, her agency supervisor sitting her down for a lengthy, encouraging conversation about pursuing a specialized medical hero certification alongside her general licensing track, an option that would let her healing quirk develop toward exactly the kind of disaster response specialty she and Izuku had spent the autumn discussing in increasingly concrete terms. "They think I could be really good at trauma response," she told Izuku one evening, still faintly amazed by the conversation even hours later, curled up on their familiar balcony with a blanket pulled tight against the winter chill. "Like, specialized training good? Advanced certification good? I don't think anybody back in the Pride Ring would believe it, honestly. The girl whose quirk was supposedly only good for being somebody's pet nurse. Funny how far a person can come once somebody finally believes them instead of just tolerating them." "I always believed it," Izuku said quietly, and Molly's answering smile, soft in the cold evening light, carried the particular warmth of someone who had heard those exact words 1,000 times over the years and never once grown tired of hearing them again. "I know," she said. "You were the very first one to. I think that's part of why it still means so much, hearing you say it. You never once needed proof." She was quiet for a moment, watching the snow gather along the balcony railing. "Sometimes I think about how different it would have been if you'd never split your lip that day. If I'd taken a different street home. It scares me a little, how much of my whole life turned on something that small." "I think about that too," Izuku admitted. "But I don't think it would have mattered which street. I think you would have found me eventually, one way or another. You've always had a way of finding the people who needed you most, whether they knew it yet or not." They spent the last evening before winter break exactly where they had spent so many of their most important evenings together, side by side on that narrow balcony, watching the snow drift lazily down over a city that had, somewhere along the way, become as much a home to both of them as the pride ring ever had, or perhaps, if either of them were honest, considerably more so. Daggy joined them briefly, bringing out mugs of hot tea with the same brisk, practical affection she had shown them since the very first night she agreed to let two small children cross a rippling basement mirror into a world neither of them fully understood, and Charlie, reached through the mirror shard for a final call before the break properly began, spent a full 20 minutes simply listening, delighted, as both children recounted the whole sprawling shape of their second-year triumphs and terrors both, with the easy, comfortable openness of two people who had never once had to hide any part of themselves from the family that had built them. "I am so proud of both of you," Charlie said, near the end of the call, her voice carrying the particular warm certainty that had defined every version of that sentiment she'd ever offered them, from a small mirror showing a bright unfamiliar city to this moment, years later, watching two nearly grown heroes stand steady and sure at the edge of everything they had worked so hard to become. "Whatever this next year brings, whatever comes after it, I want you both to know that. Always." "We know, Mom," Izuku said, and beside him Molly nodded, quiet and certain, and long after the mirror connection faded and Baggy had retreated inside to let them finish their tea in peace, the two of them remained out on that balcony a while longer, watching the snow fall over a city that had given them, against every early doubt, a life worth every single step of the long, hard road that had carried them here. Neither of them said much else that night. There was nothing left that needed saying, not really, not after everything the year had already asked of them and everything they had, in turn, given back to it without hesitation. Ahead lay a third year of trials neither could yet fully imagine, a graduation still distant but steadily approaching, internships that would sharpen into something closer to real, unsupervised responsibility, and the shared, unwavering promise of a future they intended to build exactly as they had built everything else that truly mattered between them so far. Side by side. Together. Exactly as they always had been, since a gutter, a handshake, and a promise too fierce for two small children to have ever fully understood the weight of, back when they first made it, a promise that had only grown surer, term after term, year after year, for every single test it had ever survived. Chapter 37. Third year began with a formality that had loomed, half exciting and half nerve-wracking, over the whole of Class 1A since their very first day at UA, the selection of official hero names, the identity each of them would carry into the professional world once their training finally gave way to real, independent work. Their homeroom teacher announced the assignment with his usual flat delivery, informing them that hero name proposals were due within the week, subject to review and, in some cases, gentle correction from faculty who had seen more than a few overly ambitious first attempts over the years. Izuku spent that week in exactly the state of overthinking Molly had long since learned to expect from him, filling page after page of his notebook with candidates that ranged from the overly literal to the faintly embarrassing, crossing each one out with mounting frustration until Molly finally confiscated the notebook over dinner one evening, the same familiar gesture she'd used on his over-cataloging before every major milestone of their lives together. "You're doing the thing again," she said, flipping through the crossed-out pages with visible amusement, the pencil marks dark and frustrated across page after page. "Deku Prime." "Really? That one was a joke," Izuku said, flushing. "I certainly hope so." She tapped the pencil against her chin, considering. "What about just owning the nickname?" "Bakugo meant it as an insult, sure, back when we were kids. But you've spent years turning that word into something that doesn't sting anymore. Might as well make it official. Deku. Somebody who can't be beaten down, no matter what people call him." Izuku turned the idea over, surprised by how quickly it settled into place once she said it aloud, the same particular alchemy Molly had always possessed for taking a fragile, half-formed thing and making it feel solid, real, worth keeping. "Deku," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "I think I actually love that." "Course you do," Molly said, grinning, entirely unsurprised by her own correctness, the same easy confidence she'd carried through every major decision either of them had made together since they were small enough to hold hands walking home from a demon schoolhouse. "I'm always right about this stuff." Her own hero name, when the two of them finally worked through the possibilities together over the following days, settled into place with considerably less deliberation than his had. Tide, simple and direct, exactly the kind of unadorned, confident name that suited a girl who had never once needed a flashy costume or a dramatic title to make people take her seriously. Tide, Izuku said, trying it out loud. It suits you. Steady, but impossible to actually stop once it's moving. Careful, Molly said, bumping his shoulder, or you're going to make me blush in front of the whole class when they announce it, and then everyone's going to know exactly how long we've been like this. The official announcements, made during a brief faculty assembly the following week, drew a mix of grins and groans from their assembled classmates as each hero name was read aloud alongside its owner, and when Deku and Tide were called in close succession, a fact that had not escaped their teachers' notice given how frequently the two names appeared paired together in mission logs and training reports throughout the year, more than a few classmates exchanged knowing looks that neither Izuku nor Molly bothered denying. Chapter 38. With hero names settled, the whole of third year shifted its focus toward the single largest milestone still standing between Class 1A and full graduation, the work-study program, an extended placement with a licensed agency that would carry considerably more responsibility, and considerably more real risk, than any internship they had completed so far. Izuku's mentor, informed of his growing tactical reputation across 2 years of steady, careful work, secured him a placement with one of the city's most respected mid-tier agencies, a team known for handling exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered incidents that rewarded precisely the disciplined thinking he had spent his whole life cultivating. Molly's placement, arranged through the specialized medical certification track she had pursued since the previous winter, put her directly under the mentorship of a veteran hero whose entire career had been built around exactly the kind of disaster response work she and Izuku had spent months discussing as their shared future, and though the placement meant longer, more demanding hours than either of them had faced before, both of them threw themselves into the work with the same fierce, focused determination that had carried them through every prior challenge. "This is the last real training stretch before we're actually out there," Molly said one evening, exhausted but satisfied after a particularly grueling shift. "No more classroom, no more simulation. After this, it's just us and whatever the job actually throws at us. Are you nervous?" Izuku asked, watching her carefully across the small kitchen table. Terrified, Molly admitted, with the particular honesty she had never once withheld from him, not since a rooftop under false stars years ago. But good terrified. The kind that means it actually matters. Their work-study placements, though housed at different agencies, occasionally overlapped when incidents required additional support beyond a single team's usual capacity, and it was during one such overlap, a multi-agency response to a chemical spill that had forced the evacuation of an entire residential block, that the two of them found themselves working together in an official capacity more demanding than anything their earlier fieldwork had asked of them. Izuku coordinated evacuation routes with the same careful, methodical precision that had defined his tactical thinking since his very first entrance exam, reading the shifting wind patterns and structural layout of the affected block to guide displaced residents toward the safest possible gathering point, while Molly moved through the evacuation zone treating minor exposure symptoms and calming frightened residents with the same steady, practiced warmth that had made her, in the space of just a few short years, one of the most trusted young healers any of the responding agencies had encountered. "Your kid's good," one of the veteran heroes remarked to Izuku's mentor afterward, watching Izuku direct the last of the evacuation with calm, unhurried confidence. Both of them, actually. Never seen a coordination like that outside of partners who've worked together for a decade. "They have worked together for a decade," Izuku's mentor said, with the faint, knowing amusement of someone who had heard the full story more than once by now. "Just not professionally. Yet." Chapter 39. The final license exam, the culmination of 3 full years of training, loomed on the horizon as spring settled over Muzutafu, and unlike the provisional exam that had tested them the year before, this final trial carried the full weight of everything a genuine hero career actually demanded, an extended, multi-day assessment covering strategy, physical conditioning, ethical judgment, and, in its most demanding final stage, a live coordinated response scenario built to simulate exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes incident that a newly licensed hero might realistically face within their very first year of independent work. Izuku and Molly spent the weeks leading up to the exam in a training rhythm even more intense than anything the sports festival or the provisional exam had demanded, mornings devoted to physical conditioning, afternoons split between their work-study responsibilities and focused review, evenings spent, as they so often had over the years, simply talking through scenarios together on their familiar apartment balcony, refining strategies and testing each other's reasoning until both of them could anticipate the other's instincts with barely a word exchanged between them. "You know, we've basically been training for this exact exam since we were 4 years old," Molly pointed out one evening, watching Izuku scribble through yet another scenario in his notebook. Pages of careful diagrams and contingency plans spread across the whole kitchen table by now. "Every bully we ever handled together, every villain, every rescue. It's all just been building to this." "That's a very poetic way of looking at it," Izuku said, glancing up with a small, tired smile, notebook still balanced open across his knee, pencil hovering mid-sentence over yet another carefully drafted contingency. "I contain multitudes," Molly said solemnly, and Izuku laughed, the tension of the coming exam easing, if only briefly, under the familiar warmth of her particular brand of humor, a warmth that had carried him through every hard week of study and every sleepless night of preparation across 3 long, demanding years. The exam itself, when it finally arrived, tested every ounce of preparation both of them had built over the preceding weeks. The written and ethical components passed in a blur of steady, practiced focus, years of careful study finally converging into the kind of quiet confidence that had once seemed, to a boy bleeding in a pride ring gutter, entirely out of reach. The physical conditioning trials pushed both of them to genuine exhaustion, a grueling combination of endurance tests and combat simulations that left more than a few examinees, by the final day, visibly struggling to maintain the composure the exam demanded of them. It was the final coordinated response scenario, though, that truly tested everything they had built together, a sprawling, multi-phase simulation involving a collapsed structure, a spreading chemical hazard, and a coordinated group of simulated villains, all unfolding simultaneously across a mock urban environment considerably larger and more complex than anything either of them had faced in a testing scenario before. Izuku and Molly, paired together for the exercise by the same fortunate administrative quirk that had placed them in the same group during their very first entrance exam, moved through the scenario with a coordination so seamless that the examiners, reviewing the footage afterward, remarked more than once on how difficult it was to find a single wasted movement across the entire response. They finished the scenario with every simulated civilian accounted for, every hazard contained, and both of them collapsed against a support pillar afterward, breathless, exhausted, and, for the first time in longer than either could remember, entirely certain of exactly what the coming weeks would bring. Chapter 40. The results arrived 2 weeks later, delivered not through the usual flat institutional announcement but through a formal ceremony held in UA's largest auditorium, a tradition reserved for graduating classes about to receive their full hero licenses, and Izuku sat beside Molly in the crowded hall, hands clasped tightly together beneath the folded program in his lap, waiting through what felt like the longest opening remarks of his entire life before the actual names finally began to be called. When his own name rang out across the auditorium, full hero license granted, hero name Deku officially registered, he felt Molly's hand tighten around his, and when hers followed shortly after, full license, hero name tied, he found himself on his feet applauding before he had fully processed doing so, the whole of Class 1A around them erupting into the same overwhelming, joyful noise that had once, years ago, greeted a very different kind of announcement in a very different kind of hall. Baggy, seated in the audience alongside a beaming, openly weeping Charlie who had crossed through a specially arranged mirror portal for the occasion, watched both children cross the stage to receive their formal licenses with an expression that mixed her usual controlled composure with something considerably softer underneath it. And when the ceremony finally concluded and the newly licensed graduates spilled out into the auditorium's lobby to find their families, the reunion that followed involved considerably more tears, from considerably more people, than any of them had quite anticipated. "My son," Charlie said, for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon, pulling both children into a hug fierce enough to make even Baggy's earlier embrace look restrained by comparison, "my son, and my daughter, both fully licensed heroes. I don't think I have the words for how proud I am." I don't think words were ever going to be enough for this. Mom, Izuku said, laughing even as his own eyes stung, you say that every time. And I mean it more every single time, Charlie said, entirely unrepentant, and beside her Vaggie, arms crossed but eyes suspiciously bright, offered a small, rare nod of agreement that carried, for someone as naturally reserved as she had always been, the same overwhelming weight as Charlie's tearful declarations. That evening, the whole of Class 1A gathered for a celebration that stretched long into the night, 3 years of shared struggle and shared triumph finally crystallizing into the simple, uncomplicated joy of having made it, together, to exactly the moment they had all been working towards since a very different kind of gathering, nervous and uncertain, had first brought them together in a single homeroom classroom years earlier. Bakugo, in his own gruff way, offered Izuku a genuine, if characteristically brief, handshake before the night was through, a small gesture that carried more weight than either of them fully acknowledged out loud. Their homeroom teacher, watching the celebration unfold with his usual reserved distance, allowed himself, for just a moment, something that might, on anyone else's face, have qualified as an actual smile. Izuku and Molly slipped away from the celebration late in the evening, finding a quiet corner of UA's courtyard away from the noise, the same familiar closeness that had carried them through every major moment of their lives settling comfortably between them as they sat together beneath a sky that, for once, actually held real stars, clear and bright above the city they had both, somewhere along the way, come to call home. We did it, Molly said quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. We did it, Izuku echoed, and found, turning the words over, that they carried a weight unlike anything he had ever felt before. The whole long, hard, beautiful road from a gutter behind an old cathedral district finally arriving, after all these years, at exactly the place they had both promised each other they would reach. Chapter 41. The weeks following graduation carried a strange, unfamiliar shape neither Izuku nor Molly had fully anticipated, the structured rhythm of school terms and scheduled exams giving way, almost overnight, to the open, undefined expanse of an actual career waiting to be built from scratch. Their respective work-study agencies had both extended offers of continued employment, generous, stable positions that would have let either of them step easily into a comfortable, well-supported start to professional life, and it took a long, careful evening of conversation, spread across their familiar balcony with cups of tea slowly going cold between them, before they finally, formally turned both offers down in favor of the plan they had been quietly building toward for the better part of a year. We're actually doing this, Molly said, staring at the modest stack of paperwork spread across their kitchen table, agency registration forms and licensing documentation for an independent 2-person hero team, a considerably riskier path than either of the stable positions they'd just declined. Our own thing. No safety net except each other. We've never really needed a safety net beyond each other, Izuku pointed out, and Molly's answering smile, warm and certain, confirmed that she had already known that, had probably always known it, since long before either of them had the words to properly say so. Vaggie, informed of the decision over dinner that same week, offered considerably less resistance than either of them had braced for, her own memory of building something uncertain and unproven out of nothing but stubborn conviction clearly coloring her reaction. It's a harder road, she said simply, setting down her chopsticks to look at them both with the particular direct honesty she reserved for moments that mattered most. No established agency name behind you, no built-in client base, no safety net if a case goes wrong in a way individual heroes can't always control. But I watched 2 people build a hotel out of nothing but stubborn hope once, and it's still standing all these years later. I'm not about to tell either of you that hope doesn't count for something. Charlie's reaction, delivered through the mirror shard, was considerably more effusive, involving an extended, tearful speech about legacy and choice and the particular pride of watching 2 children build something entirely their own rather than simply inheriting a path laid out for them, and though Izuku gently teased her afterward for the sheer length of the speech, he found, turning it over privately later that night, that every word of it had settled somewhere warm and permanent in his chest. The registration process itself took the better part of a month, careful paperwork and agency compliance reviews that tested Izuku's patience considerably more than any physical training exercise ever had, but by the time early summer settled properly over Muzutafu, Deku, and Tide independent rescue operations, a name Molly had insisted on with characteristic bluntness after rejecting several of Izuku's more elaborate suggestions, stood officially registered, licensed, and, for the very first time in either of their lives, entirely their own. Chapter 42. Their first official case arrived within days of the registration finalizing, a modest, unglamorous request from a neighborhood association concerned about a series of minor break-ins that the local police department, stretched thin across a larger ongoing investigation, had not yet found the resources to properly address. It was not, by any measure, the kind of dramatic debut either of them might have imagined as children pressing their hands against a rippling basement mirror, but Izuku approached the case with exactly the same careful, methodical seriousness he brought to everything, mapping the pattern of break-ins against foot traffic and lighting conditions until a clear, predictable pattern began to emerge. Same 3 blocks, always after midnight, always targeting homes with side entrances hidden from the street, he told Molly, spreading his notes across their kitchen table with visible excitement despite the case's modest scale. I think if we position ourselves along this stretch here, we've got a good chance of actually catching whoever's doing this in the act. Look at you, Molly said, grinning, getting all excited about a string of burglaries like it's the sports festival all over again. Every case matters, Izuku said, though the faint flush creeping up his neck suggested he knew exactly how thoroughly his enthusiasm had gotten away from him. Even the small ones. Especially the small ones, probably. This is somebody's home. Somebody's peace of mind. They caught the culprit 2 nights later, a young man struggling with a gambling debt who had turned to increasingly desperate measures out of a fear and shame he confessed to almost the moment Molly's calm, steady presence gave him room to do so rather than simply panicking further under the threat of confrontation. It was Izuku's careful positioning that cornered him, but it was Molly's particular gift for making frightened people feel safe enough to stop running that actually resolved the situation without a single blow exchanged, and by the time the local police arrived to formally take the man into custody, he had already, quietly and with visible relief, agreed to accept the debt counseling resources Molly had gently suggested rather than continuing down a path that would only have led him somewhere considerably worse. That's not really what I expected our first case to look like, Izuku admitted afterward, the 2 of them walking home together through streets gone quiet with the deep hours of the night. Most of them probably won't look like sports festival battles, Molly said, echoing a thought she'd voiced more than once over the preceding year of fieldwork. Most of them are just scared, desperate people who need someone to actually see them instead of just stopping them. I think that's the job we actually want, honestly. Not just villains and disasters. People. The neighborhood association's grateful, glowing review, posted within days across the kind of local community boards that mattered far more to a fledgling independent agency than any national ranking ever could, brought a small but steady trickle of new requests over the following weeks, and Izuku and Molly, working through each case with the same careful, complementary rhythm that had defined their partnership since childhood, found their small, self-built agency slowly, steadily taking real shape beneath them. Chapter 43. It was nearly 2 months into their independent operation, their small but growing reputation still largely confined to Muzitafu's local network of grateful clients and word-of-mouth referrals, that a case arrived carrying stakes considerably higher than anything they had yet handled on their own. A missing persons report, filed by a frantic mother whose teenage son had failed to return home from what should have been a short walk to a nearby convenience store, had stalled in the police department's overloaded queue for the better part of 2 days before a sympathetic officer, familiar with the growing reputation of the young independent agency operating out of a modest storefront office near the train station, quietly suggested the family reach out directly. Izuku threw himself into the case with an intensity that left Molly, watching him pore over the boy's last known movements and the neighborhood's security camera coverage late into the night, gently but firmly insisting he actually eat something and sleep at least a few hours before the search resumed at dawn. You're not going to help him if you run yourself into the ground first, she said, setting a plate down in front of him with the same brisk, no-nonsense care Vaggie had shown them both 1,000 times over the years. I know how much this matters to you. It matters to me too. But panic doesn't solve cases. Your careful, methodical brain does. Feed it properly. He ate. He slept, if only for a few reluctant hours, and by the following morning, working through the last known footage with fresh, clearer eyes, He finally spotted the detail that had been eluding him through the previous night's exhausted searching, a partial glimpse of the boy following a stranger down an alley 2 streets over from the convenience store, visible for barely half a second at the very edge of a neighboring shop's security camera. The trail led them, over the following tense hours, to an abandoned warehouse on the city's industrial edge, and the confrontation that followed carried a genuine, sharp-edged danger that neither of them had faced together since the mountain training camp attack years earlier. The man responsible for the boy's disappearance revealed, once they finally located him, to be dangerously unstable and considerably more willing to use force than either of them had anticipated from a case that had begun as a routine missing persons report. Izuku's careful reading of the warehouse's layout, every exit and blind corner catalogued with the same instinctive precision he had honed since his very first entrance exam, guided them toward the boy's location without triggering the confrontation their target clearly wanted, while Molly, moving with the fierce, focused calm that had defined her since she was a small girl standing between him and a pack of imp children, kept the frightened, injured teenager steady and calm the moment they finally reached him, her healing hands working quickly over a series of injuries that made both of them privately, furiously grateful they had arrived when they did rather than any later. The man was apprehended shortly after by responding police officers, alerted the moment Izuku had confirmed the boy's location, and it was only once the whole ordeal had finally, fully concluded, the boy safely reunited with his sobbing, overwhelmed mother, that Izuku allowed himself to feel the full weight of exactly how close the whole situation had come to ending considerably worse than it had. "We got him back," Molly said quietly, finding Izuku sitting on the warehouse's loading dock steps afterward, staring at his own shaking hands. "Izuku. We got him back safe. That's what matters." "I know," Izuku said, and found, when she settled beside him and wrapped her arms around him without a word, that the shaking finally, slowly began to still, the same steady, patient comfort she had always offered him, since long before either of them had a license or a title or anything more than a promise made too young to fully understand its own weight. Chapter 44. The missing persons case, and the swift, decisive resolution the two of them had brought to it, marked a clear turning point in their small agency's local reputation, word spreading quickly through Muzutafu's tight-knit community networks about the young independent team who had succeeded where an overloaded police department had, through no real fault of their own, been unable to move quickly enough. Requests for their services increased steadily in the weeks that followed, and though Izuku and Molly remained careful, deliberate about which cases they took on, mindful of Vagi's frequent, gentle reminders that a small two-person operation could only stretch so thin before the quality of their work began to suffer, the growing trust of their community settled into both of them as a particular, quiet kind of validation neither had fully anticipated feeling. "We're actually doing it," Izuku said one evening, reviewing their case log with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with rankings or sports festival scoreboards at all. "Real work. Real people actually helped, because we were there to help them." "Told you it would feel different from training," Molly said, settling in beside him with her own quiet, contented pride. "Better, somehow. Even the hard cases. Especially the hard cases, maybe." Their success drew attention beyond the immediate neighborhood eventually, a modest feature in a local news segment about rising independent hero agencies bringing their names to a slightly wider audience, and though neither of them had ever particularly craved the kind of fame that had once seemed, to a small boy watching grainy hero footage on an old television, like the whole point of the profession, the recognition brought with it a satisfying, practical benefit neither had fully anticipated. Larger agencies, impressed by the pair's growing track record, began reaching out with offers of occasional collaborative work on cases too large for their small independent team to handle entirely alone. It was during one such collaborative case, a large-scale search and rescue operation following severe flooding in a neighboring district, that Izuku and Molly found themselves working alongside several established, senior heroes for the first time since their earliest training days, and the particular, quiet satisfaction of holding their own, coordinating seamlessly with heroes whose careers stretched back well before either of them had even been born, settled into both of them as a confirmation of exactly how far they had come from a boy bleeding in a gutter and a girl with a supposedly boring healing quirk that nobody in an entire kingdom of demons had ever properly valued. "You two work like veterans," one of the senior heroes remarked afterward, echoing almost exactly the same observation their work-study supervisor had once made, which is a strange thing to say about a team barely out of school. We've had a lot of practice, Molly said, catching Izuku's eye with the same small, private smile she always wore whenever their shared history came up in conversation, the whole weight of a decade and a half of partnership compressed into one simple, knowing look. Chapter 45. Autumn arrived again, marking a full year since their graduation, and with it came a particular, quiet milestone that neither of them had rushed toward but both had, in their own separate ways, been steadily building toward since a quiet evening conversation on their apartment balcony years earlier. Izuku had been carrying a small, carefully wrapped box in his jacket pocket for the better part of 2 weeks, waiting, with a patience that surprised even himself, for exactly the right moment, though he privately suspected, watching Molly move through their small shared office with the same easy, confident grace she brought to everything, that there was no single perfect moment so much as 1,000 ordinary ones, any of which would have suited the occasion just fine. He chose, in the end, the same rooftop where it had all first properly begun, the modest, familiar rooftop of the apartment building that had been their home since they were children crossing a basement mirror together for the very first time, the same false stars of their childhood replaced now by a real, clear sky spread out above a city that had given them, against every early doubt, a whole life worth building together. You're being weird, Molly said, following him up the fire escape with faint, amused suspicion, still dressed in the same practical work clothes she'd worn all day, hair still faintly damp from a shower she'd rushed through the moment they'd closed the office. You've been weird all week, actually. What's going on? Do you remember, Izuku said, turning to face her once they reached the roof's edge, heart hammering considerably harder than it had during any exam or crisis he had ever faced professionally, his palms distinctly sweatier than they'd been through even the mountain camp's worst hour, the first thing you ever said to me? In that alley, when we were 4. Something about you bleeding too easy, Molly said, brow furrowing slightly, though a slow, curious smile was already beginning to tug at the corner of her mouth. Izuku, what? You said I don't break promises, once, he continued, pulling the small box from his pocket with hands that shook only slightly. You've said it about 100 times since, actually. And I've spent a lot of years thinking about the biggest promise either of us could possibly make to each other, and I think I finally figured out what it is. Molly's hands flew to her mouth the moment he opened the box, her composure, usually so steady and unshakable, dissolving entirely into something raw and overwhelmed and utterly, uncharacteristically speechless, and for a long, breathless moment neither of them said anything at all, the whole weight of a lifetime spent choosing each other, over and over, settling into the quiet, charged space between them. Molly Marlin, Izuku said, voice unsteady but certain, will you marry me? Obviously, Molly said, the exact same word she had used on a gutter street behind an old cathedral district 16 years earlier, half laughing and half crying all at once as she pulled him into a fierce, overwhelming embrace. Obviously, you absolute idiot, ask me a real question next time. Chapter 46. The news, once it finally settled into something both of them could speak about without dissolving immediately into overwhelmed laughter, spread through their small circle of family with exactly the kind of joyful chaos either of them might have predicted. Daggy, informed the following morning over breakfast, set down her tea with visible, uncharacteristic emotion, and though she said very little at first, the fierce, lingering hug she pulled them both into spoke volumes that her usual careful reserve rarely allowed her words to manage. Charlie's reaction, delivered through the mirror shard within the hour, involved a level of joyful, overwhelmed noise that had Baggy affectionately rolling her eyes even as her own smile refused to fully fade. I am going to plan the most spectacular wedding this side of either the human world or hell itself, Charlie declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had clearly seen considerable use already that morning. You two are not to argue with me about this. I have been waiting for this exact moment since I first watched you shake hands on a rooftop when you were 4 years old, and I intend to make full use of every ounce of royal authority I have accumulated over the centuries to make it absolutely perfect. Mom, Izuku said, laughing, we haven't even set a date yet. Details, Charlie said, entirely unbothered, and beside her image in the small rippling mirror, Baggy's faint, resigned sigh suggested she had already, quietly, resigned herself to whatever elaborate plans her partner was about to set into motion regardless of anyone else's input. Molly's mother, reached through a separate call arranged for later that same week, received the news with her own characteristic bluntness. A warm, gruff congratulations followed almost immediately by a series of practical questions about timeline and logistics that had Molly laughing despite herself at how thoroughly her mother's pragmatic nature had clearly passed down to her. "Knew it the day you healed that boy's split lip in the gutter," Marlon said, with the particular satisfied certainty of a parent who had, in fact, seen this exact outcome coming for the better part of 2 decades. "Told your father as much that very same evening. He owes me considerably, wherever he's gotten himself off to these days." The weeks that followed carried a warm, settled happiness neither Izuku nor Molly had fully anticipated feeling amid the ordinary, steady rhythm of their growing agency's caseload, engagement, and career building somehow, improbably, complementing each other rather than competing for the same limited hours in each day. Their small independent team continued its steady, careful growth, each case handled with the same complementary precision that had defined their partnership since a gutter and a handshake, and the particular, quiet satisfaction of building both a shared career and a shared future, side by side, exactly as they had always intended, settled into both of them as the truest, most certain thing either had ever known. Chapter 47. It was on a quiet evening several months later, their agency's modest office finally closed for the day, that Izuku found himself standing again at the same apartment balcony where so much of their shared life had unfolded over the years, watching Molly review the last of the day's paperwork with the same easy, practiced focus she brought to everything, and found himself turning over, not for the first time, the sheer improbable distance between the boy who had once believed himself worth nothing at all and the man standing here now, engaged to the fiercest, most steadfast person he had ever known, building a life and a career that had once seemed, to a small child pressing his hands against a rippling basement mirror, as distant and unreachable as the stars themselves. "You're doing the thoughtful staring thing again," Molly said, without looking up from her paperwork, the same easy, familiar teasing that had carried them through nearly every quiet evening of their shared life together. "Just thinking," Izuku admitted, settling beside her. "About everything. How far we've come. How none of this would have happened if you hadn't come down that alley." "We've had this conversation before," Molly said, setting the paperwork aside to fully face him, her black eyes warm and steady in the fading evening light. "I keep telling you. I think you'd have found your way regardless. I just made it a little less lonely along the way." "You made it possible," Izuku said, the same words he had told her once before, on a different evening, at a different, earlier point in their long shared story, and found that they carried, if anything, even more weight now than they had then. "Every single part of it, Molly. The friend who protected me. The partner who fought beside me. The person I'm going to marry. I don't know who I'd be without any of it. I don't ever want to find out." Molly didn't have a ready response for that, not right away, the particular rare moment of speechlessness that only ever seemed to overtake her during the conversations that mattered most, and instead she simply leaned into him, the same old familiar gesture from a rooftop under false stars so many years ago, shoulder pressed warm against his, and together they watched the city lights flicker on below them, a whole shared future stretching out ahead, certain and steady and entirely, permanently theirs. Somewhere beyond that quiet evening lay a wedding still being planned with Charlie's characteristic enthusiasm, a growing independent agency still finding its full shape in the world, and a whole long career of heroism still waiting to be built, case by case, rescue by rescue, exactly the way they had always built everything that truly mattered between them. But for now there was only the warm, settled quiet of the balcony, the steady weight of Molly's shoulder against his, and the certain, unshakable knowledge that whatever came next, they would meet it exactly as they always had. Together. Chapter 48. Winter came again, the third since their graduation, and with it came the steady, meaningful work of actually planning a wedding, a task that Charlie approached with an enthusiasm bordering on the overwhelming and that baggy, true to form, tempered with a practical, grounded steadiness that kept the whole affair from spiraling entirely out of either child's control. Izuku found himself, more than once, quietly grateful for his mother's fierce, protective partner, whose blunt, no-nonsense approach to venue selection and guest coordination saved both him and Molly from what might otherwise have become an entirely unmanageable production. "Your mother wants doves," Baggy informed them both flatly one evening, reviewing a lengthy list of proposed wedding elements with visible, long-suffering patience. Actual doves. I've already told her no, but I suspect she's going to bring it up again at least 3 more times before the actual date. Doves would be nice, Molly said, entirely too innocently, and Vaggy's flat, unimpressed stare in response had both children dissolving into laughter that lasted a good deal longer than the joke probably warranted, the particular easy warmth of family teasing settling comfortably around the whole planning process despite its occasional chaos. Their small agency's caseload continued alongside the wedding preparations, neither of them willing to let the growing excitement of the coming ceremony distract from the steady, meaningful work that had, over the preceding year and a half, become as central to their shared identity as anything else in their lives. A particularly demanding case arrived that winter, a coordinated string of thefts targeting a series of small local businesses that had, despite the modest scale of each individual incident, left an entire neighborhood's shopkeepers anxious and increasingly desperate for a resolution the overstretched police department had struggled to provide. Izuku approached the case with his usual methodical thoroughness, tracking patterns across seemingly unconnected incidents until a clear, coordinated operation emerged from what had initially appeared to be a series of isolated, unrelated crimes, and the eventual confrontation, when it finally came, tested both of them in ways that echoed, distantly, the greater dangers they had faced together over the years without ever quite reaching that same level of genuine peril. It resolved, in the end, with the same complementary rhythm that had defined every case before it, Izuku's careful strategy cornering the responsible parties while Molly's steady, calming presence ensured the whole confrontation concluded without serious injury to anyone involved, including, notably, the frightened, desperate young men responsible for the thefts in the first place, whom Molly insisted, over Izuku's initial hesitation, deserved a chance at genuine rehabilitation rather than simple, uncomplicated punishment. Everybody deserves a chance to be more than their worst moment, she said afterward, echoing a sentiment that had guided her approach to every difficult case since their very first burglary investigation months earlier, a philosophy she had carried since childhood, since long before either of them had ever imagined building an entire career around it. Doesn't mean there aren't consequences. Just means the consequences shouldn't be the whole story, if we can help it. It was, Izuku reflected, exactly the kind of hard-won wisdom that had defined their entire partnership since a rooftop under false stars, the particular balance of fierce protection and genuine compassion that Molly had carried, unwavering, since she was a small girl standing between him and a pack of cruel imp children, and he found himself, watching her work through the case's aftermath with the same steady conviction she brought to everything, more certain than ever that he had chosen exactly the right person to build the whole of his life around. Chapter 49. Spring arrived at last, carrying with it the wedding date both families had spent the better part of a year carefully, joyfully planning toward, and the ceremony itself, held in a quiet garden venue on the outskirts of Muzutafu that Vaggy had selected after firmly overruling several of Charlie's more elaborate suggestions, unfolded on a bright, clear afternoon that felt, to Izuku, standing at the front of the small gathered crowd with his heart hammering considerably harder than it had during any exam or crisis he had ever faced, like the culmination of every promise the two of them had ever made to each other since a gutter behind an old cathedral district. Charlie, serving as officiant in a role she had lobbied for with an intensity that left absolutely no room for argument, managed to make it through the ceremony's opening remarks with only a modest amount of happy, overwhelmed crying, dabbing at her eyes more than once as she looked out over the small, gathered crowd of classmates, mentors, and family who had traveled from both the human world and the far reaches of hell itself to witness the occasion. Vaggy sat in the front row beside a very proud, very composed Marlin, both women watching with the particular quiet satisfaction of parents who had, each in their own way, helped raise the two people now standing at the garden's flower-draped arch. When Molly finally appeared at the far end of the aisle, her usual sleek confidence softened into something considerably more nervous and considerably more radiant than Izuku had ever seen her. He found himself, for one brief, overwhelming moment, entirely unable to speak at all, the whole of their shared history, every wound healed and every promise kept since they were 4 years old, compressing into a single, breathless heartbeat as she made her way toward him. "You're staring," she murmured, once she finally reached his side, her old teasing humor breaking through the nervous formality of the moment with characteristic ease. "I'm allowed to stare," Izuku murmured back, grinning despite the tears he could feel gathering at the corners of his own eyes. "You look incredible." The vows they exchanged carried none of the elaborate, formal language either family had half expected, both of them choosing instead to speak plainly, honestly, in the same straightforward way that had defined their entire relationship since the very beginning, promises built not around grand poetic declarations but around the same simple, steady commitment that had carried them through every year since a rooftop under false stars. "I promise," Izuku said, voice thick but steady, "to keep choosing you, exactly the way I always have, in every version of every life we might have lived. I don't know who I'd be without you. I never want to find out." "I promise," Molly said, her own voice unsteady with an emotion she rarely let show so openly, "to keep protecting you, the way I promised the very first day we met, and to keep believing in every part of you that you sometimes forget to believe in yourself." "I don't break promises, Izuku. I never have. I never will." Chapter 50. The reception that followed carried on long into the evening, laughter and music and the particular, overwhelming warmth of a family built from two very different worlds finally, fully coming together in celebration, and Izuku found himself, at more than one point throughout the night, simply pausing amid the noise and joy to take in the sheer, improbable scope of everything gathered around him. Classmates from Class 1A, several already building their own hero careers across the country, had traveled considerable distances to attend, and even Bakugo, gruff and characteristically reluctant about the whole affair, had shown up with a gift that surprised both Izuku and Molly considerably more than his brief, awkward congratulations had. "Don't get sentimental about it," Bakugo warned, thrusting the wrapped box into Izuku's hands with visible discomfort. "It's just a decent gift. Don't read into it." "Wouldn't dream of it," Izuku said, grinning, and found, watching Bakugo retreat quickly toward the open bar to avoid any further emotional engagement with the moment, that he genuinely meant it, the old rivalry between them long since settled into something considerably closer to mutual, if gruffly expressed, respect. Charlie spent much of the evening moving between guests with an openness and warmth that left more than a few of the human attendees quietly charmed despite the occasional, careful reminders Vaggie offered about which particular details of Hell's more unusual customs were probably best left unmentioned in polite human company, and it was well past midnight, the crowd finally beginning to thin, that Izuku found himself standing again with Molly at the edge of the garden venue, both of them exhausted, overwhelmed, and entirely, permanently happy in a way that neither had fully anticipated feeling even amid all the joyful anticipation of the preceding months. "We're actually married," Molly said, staring down at the ring on her hand with an expression of quiet, still faintly disbelieving wonder. "We're actually married," Izuku echoed, and found the words settling into his chest with the same warm, permanent certainty that had carried every major promise of their shared life together, from a gutter to a rooftop to a UA classroom to this quiet garden, now finally, fully realized. They left for a brief honeymoon the following week, a quiet coastal retreat not far from the beach town where Vaggie had once taken them both on their very first proper vacation, and spent the days that followed in the particular, uncomplicated peace of two people who had, after a lifetime of struggle and triumph shared in equal measure, finally arrived at exactly the life they had always promised each other they would build. Chapter 51. They returned to Muzitafu, and to their small, steadily growing agency, with the same renewed energy and settled contentment that had carried them through every major milestone of their shared life, and the years that followed unfolded in the particular, satisfying rhythm of a partnership that had long since proven, over and over, exactly how much strength lay in the combination of Izuku's careful, disciplined strategy and Molly's fierce, steady healing. Deku and Tide independent rescue operations grew steadily over the following years, their reputation for careful, compassionate handling of everything from routine neighborhood disputes to genuine large-scale disasters spreading well beyond Muzitafu's borders, until the small storefront office they had first registered together gave way, eventually, to a proper agency headquarters staffed by a small, carefully chosen team of junior heroes who had sought them out specifically for the particular values-driven approach to heroism that had defined their partnership from its very first gutter-bound handshake. Charlie visited often, slipping through the mirror crossing whenever her duties in Hell allowed, and took particular delight in watching her son and daughter-in-law build exactly the kind of life she had once only dared hope might be possible for a child born into a kingdom that had never quite known what to do with someone so fundamentally, stubbornly gentle. Vaggie, though she would never fully admit to the depth of her own pride out loud, kept a small, carefully maintained scrapbook of newspaper clippings and case reports tucked away in a drawer at the hotel, a quiet record of every milestone the two of them had achieved since the very first night she had agreed, reluctantly, to let two small children cross a basement mirror into a world neither of them fully understood. Molly's healing quirk, refined over years of demanding fieldwork into something considerably more powerful and precise than the simple gift she had first discovered comforting a crying boy in a gutter, eventually earned her a specialized reputation across the country's disaster response networks, her name recommended, more than once, for national-level crisis response teams that would have carried her, and by extension Izuku, into considerably higher profile work than the modest independent agency they had built together. She turned down every offer, each time, with the same blunt, characteristic certainty that had defined her since childhood. "We already found the kind of work we actually want to do," she told one particularly persistent recruiter, during a conversation Izuku overheard with no small amount of quiet pride. "Real people. Real neighborhoods. I don't need a bigger stage to know the work matters." Chapter 52. It was on an ordinary evening years later, their agency's modest headquarters finally quiet after a long, demanding day, that Izuku found himself once again standing at the familiar balcony of the apartment they still, despite their growing success, refused to give up, watching the city they had both grown up in their own strange, separate ways, spread out beneath them in its usual warm, electric glow. Molly joined him there, as she always had, settling against his side with the same easy, familiar closeness that had carried them through every year since a rooftop under false stars first taught them exactly what that particular word, together, was truly capable of meaning. "Do you ever think about it?" Izuku asked, echoing an old, familiar question from years earlier. How different everything could have gone. "All the time," Molly admitted, "and every single time I land on the same answer. I'm glad it went exactly the way it did. Every hard part included. It's what got us here." Here had come to mean a great many things over the years: a thriving independent agency built entirely on their own terms, a family spread across two entirely different worlds that had, against every early doubt, found a way to love each other fully and completely, and a partnership, both professional and deeply personal, that had never once, in all the years since a gutter and a handshake, come close to breaking. It meant, too, a whole life still stretching ahead of them, full of cases yet to be solved and dangers yet to be faced and small, ordinary evenings yet to be spent exactly like this one, shoulder to shoulder, watching a city they had chosen, and been chosen by in turn, settle into its familiar evening quiet. Together, Izuku said, the same word it had always been, carrying now the whole accumulated weight of everything they had built, promised, and kept, across every single year since a small, hurting boy first looked up from a gutter to find a fierce, sharp-toothed girl standing between him and the world's cruelty, offering nothing more or less than her whole, unwavering self. Together, Molly agreed, and beneath them, the city carried on in its ordinary, bustling way, entirely unaware of just how much two children of hell, grown now into two of its most steadfast protectors, had given to make sure it always would. Chapter 53. Years later, when younger heroes fresh out of their own training programs occasionally asked Izuku and Molly, by then two of the most respected independent operators in the greater Musitifa region, what advice they might offer someone just starting out, the two of them tended to answer, more often than not, with some version of the same story, told a little differently depending on which of them was doing the telling, but always circling back to the same central truth. A gutter behind an old cathedral district. A split lip. A girl with a healing quirk everyone else had dismissed as boring, kneeling down to fix a wound she had no obligation at all to fix, simply because it was the right thing to do. People think heroism is about the big moments, Izuku told one such young hero, a nervous, earnest recent graduate who had sought out their agency specifically for mentorship after hearing their story secondhand from a mutual contact. The rescues that make the news, the villains you take down. Sometimes it is. But mostly it's about deciding, over and over, in 1,000 small unremarkable moments, that you're going to show up for someone else instead of just yourself. That's the actual foundation everything else gets built on. And find yourself a Molly, Molly added, entirely unbothered by her own immodesty, drawing a startled laugh from their young visitor. Someone who'll stand between you and the worst of it before you even fully understand you need it. Someone who'll heal what needs healing and tell you the truth about everything else. I'm not saying it has to be romantic, she added, catching Izuku's fond, amused glance, though it certainly worked out that way for us. I'm saying nobody does this job well entirely alone. Find your people. Build something real with them. The rest tends to follow. It was advice born of a lifetime spent proving, over and over, exactly how true it was, from a gutter to a rooftop to a UA classroom to a garden wedding to the steady, satisfying work of an agency built entirely on their own terms, and watching their young visitor leave that afternoon with notebook filled and resolve visibly strengthened, Izuku found himself struck, not for the first time, by the particular, quiet privilege of having become, somewhere along the long road from that very first split lip, exactly the kind of person a frightened, hopeful child might once have looked up to. You're doing the thoughtful staring thing again, Molly observed, nudging him lightly as their visitor's footsteps faded down the agency's front steps. Just thinking about how far we've come, Izuku said, the same familiar refrain that had echoed through nearly every quiet, reflective moment of their shared life together, and found, as he always did, that Molly's answering smile, warm and certain and utterly unchanged since the very first time she'd offered it to him in a gutter behind an old cathedral district, remained exactly as steady and exactly as home as it had always been. Whatever the years still ahead had waiting for them, whatever new cases and challenges and quiet, ordinary evenings still stretched out before two heroes who had built their entire lives around a single, unbreakable promise, they would face all of it, as they always had, and as they always fully intended to, together. Chapter 54. Looking back on it all, years later, Izuku sometimes found himself returning to the small mirror shard that Charlie had once given Baggy for exactly these kinds of quiet, reflective evenings, its surface still rippling faintly whenever he pressed a hand to it, still connecting, after all these years, to a mother whose pride in him had never once wavered since the night she first held him, small and wailing, wrapped in blankets stitched together from bar towels because nobody in an entire hotel of reformed demons had thought to keep proper baby supplies on hand. He would tell her, on those evenings, about the small victories of the week, a family reunited, a neighborhood made a little safer, a young hero mentored a little further along their own uncertain path, and Charlie, listening from the other side of a mirror that had once shown a small, hurting boy his very first glimpse of a bright and unfamiliar world, would smile the same warm, unwavering smile she had carried since the very beginning. Baggy, too, remained a constant presence in their lives, her fierce, protective love never once diminished by the passing years, and it became something of a treasured tradition, in the seasons that followed their wedding, for the whole extended family, Charlie and Baggy, Molly's mother Marlin, and eventually, as their agency continued to grow, the small found family of junior heroes who had gathered around Izuku and Molly's mentorship, to share a meal together whenever schedules allowed, the particular chaotic warmth of that gathered table standing as its own quiet testament to everything two children of hell had built since a gutter, a handshake, and a promise that had never once come close to breaking. There were harder years too, cases that ended less cleanly than either of them would have liked, nights spent holding each other through the particular ache of having done everything right and still not been quite enough to save everyone who needed saving. Molly's healing, powerful as it had become, still could not touch every wound, and Izuku's careful strategy, honed across a lifetime of study, still occasionally met a crisis that outpaced even his most thorough preparation. They carried those harder nights together too, exactly as they carried everything else, neither of them ever quite alone with the weight of it, and if the work sometimes asked more of them than either had bargained for as small children dreaming of heroism through a rippling basement mirror, they never once regretted the choosing of it, not for a single day. Worth it, Molly said once, on one such harder evening, her voice quiet and certain even through the exhaustion of a case that had not ended the way either of them had hoped. All of it. Even the parts that hurt. Worth it, Izuku agreed, and found, turning the whole shape of their long, hard, beautiful life over in his mind, that the words had never once felt more true. Chapter 55. On the anniversary of their very first meeting, a date neither of them had ever formally marked as children but had, somewhere in the years since, quietly begun to treat as its own small private holiday, Izuku and Molly returned, as they had every year since their wedding, to the narrow alley behind what had once been the old cathedral district, now transformed by decades of hell's own slow, steady rehabilitation efforts into something considerably less grim than it had been in their childhood. Though the particular stretch of gutter where a small, bleeding boy had once looked up to find a fierce, sharp-toothed girl standing over him remained, by unspoken mutual agreement, exactly as it had always been, untouched and unchanged, a quiet monument neither of them needed to explain to anyone else. 16 years since the actual day, Molly said, crouching down beside the familiar patch of pavement with the same easy, deliberate care she brought to everything that mattered to her. Feels like both a lot longer and no time at all. I still remember exactly what you looked like, you know. Lips split, eyes wide, absolutely certain I was about to make fun of you the same way everyone else always did. And instead you fixed me and called yourself amazing, Izuku said, grinning. Well, I called you amazing first. You just agreed rather quickly. That's basically the definition of a good life, I think, Izuku said, crouching beside her, and found, looking at the worn, familiar stones of a street that had once represented everything cruel and dismissive about the only world he'd known as a small child, that it no longer carried any of that old weight at all, transformed instead, entirely, by the memory of a promise made here and kept, faithfully, every single day since, through gutters and rooftops and exam halls and a garden wedding and every ordinary evening in between that had somehow, together, added up to an entire life worth living. They did not linger long, these annual visits never demanding much beyond a quiet, private acknowledgement of exactly where their whole shared story had first begun, and by the time they made their way back toward the mirror crossing that would carry them home to Muzitafu, back to an agency full of cases waiting and a life built entirely on their own determined terms, the particular warmth of the visit had settled, as it always did, into something steady and certain that would carry them comfortably through whatever the coming year still had in store, another 12 months of small victories and hard nights, of mentoring young heroes and coming home exhausted to each other's steady presence, of building, brick by careful brick, exactly the kind of life two small children in a gutter could never have imagined for themselves and yet had, somehow, earned every single day since. Same time next year? Molly asked, the same question she asked every single time, though the answer had never once been in doubt, not since the very first time she'd asked it, standing on this exact stretch of pavement with her hand still faintly warm from healing a wound that had, in its own strange way, ended up healing so much more than a single split lip ever could have. Same time next year, Izuku agreed, and together, hand in hand, they stepped back through the rippling mirror, leaving behind the gutter where it had all begun and carrying forward, as they always had and always would, everything it had taught them about love, and loyalty, and the particular, unbreakable strength of a promise two small children had made to each other, long before either of them fully understood the weight of exactly what they were choosing. Thanks for listening.